Well, good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the 33rd meeting of the Public Audit Committee in 2025. The first agenda item is for members of the committee to decide whether or not to take agenda items 4, 5, 6 and 7 in private this morning. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Could I just draw to your attention as well that Joe Fitzpatrick is joining us this morning, but he's joining us online. So when I invite Joe to ask some questions or bring him in, he'll be doing that via the video link. But can I welcome our witnesses who are with us in the committee room this morning to give evidence on the Auditor General for Scotland and Accounts Commission report on improving care experience, delivering the promise. Can I welcome our witnesses this morning? First of all, the Director General, Education and Justice, Neil Rennick. Good morning, Director General. And also from the Scottish Government is Andrew Watson, who is the Director for Children and Families, and Gavin Henderson, who is the Deputy Director for Care Experience, Children's Services and the Promise in the Government. We're also pleased to welcome to the committee this morning the Chief Executive of the Promise Scotland, Fraser McKinley. Morning, Mr McKinley. And David Anderson, who's the Chair of the Oversight Board for Keeping the Promise. Good morning to you both. And finally, from the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, we're joined by two witnesses, Nicola Dickey, who is the Director of People Policy, and Fiona Whitelock, who is the Policy Manager at COSLA for the Promise. We've got a number of questions to put to you, and I should say at the very outset, you don't all necessarily need to feel obliged to answer all of the questions we put, but if you feel as though you've got something relevant to say, then please indicate, and we'll do our level best to bring you in. But before we get to any questions that we might have, Director General, could I invite you to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Convener. I really appreciate this opportunity to provide evidence today. I'm particularly pleased to be joined by our partners from COSLA, the Promise Scotland and the Oversight Board. As Audit Scotland stated in their evidence to the committee, the commitment of individuals and organisations to deliver the promise remains strong. Since the publication of the Care Review in 2020, based on the experiences of over 5,500 children, families and others, we have been working in partnership to drive forward the necessary changes to improve the experiences and outcomes. This work has focused on embedding the principles of love, care and respect across services and addressing the systemic barriers that have historically impacted those with care experience. There can be no question that keeping the promise is at the heart of the work that we do across ministerial portfolios, and I welcome the Audit Scotland's report and recommendations. In particular, Audit Scotland identifies the benefit in strengthening transparency and ensuring that resources are targeted effectively. The prioritisation of sustained investment, workforce development and the whole system approach to change must be our collective focus. As Audit Scotland indicated in their evidence, their report does not look at detailed progress of how the promise is being implemented in individual areas. The report, therefore, is best seen sitting alongside a number of other reports that have been published setting out a range of evidence at national and local level on how the promise is being delivered. Taken together, these reports provide a consistent picture of changes being made both in delivery and culture, but also in the need to increase the pace and scale of activity to meet the commitment to keep the promise by 2030. The reports identify a number of headwinds that we and local partners have faced since 2020, including COVID, the cost of living challenges and the increasing complexity of care needs. We are not blind nor shy away from the challenges that remain. Delivering the promise is a long-term commitment, and as Audit Scotland has indicated, it is not a single entity or programme and is complex by its nature. It requires a wide range of delivery partners across the public and third sector to be dynamic in our approach and to remain agile in building on the benefits that have been realised so far. We can talk some more about the actions that we are taking collectively and individually in response to the lessons since 2020, and I look forward to discussing with the committee the findings of the Audit Scotland report.
Thank you very much indeed, Director General. Just for the record, could I ask whether the Scottish Government accepts the findings and recommendations of the Audit Scotland Accounts Commission report?
Yes, we do. And I would particularly say I think it's a helpful addition to a range of different reports that have been published, and I'd want to place it in that context of a number of different reports that I can talk about that have provided a richer set of evidence of what has been delivered since 2020.
Yeah, you'll understand that we're here primarily to discuss the report produced by the Auditor General and the Accounts Commission this morning, but if you wish to refer to other reports, we will, of course, listen to that. Mr McKinley, can I ask, from the point of view of the promise, whether you accept the findings and recommendations of the report?
We do, Convener, yeah, and conversations have started already about responding to those, so, yeah.
Yeah, because I did notice that you said, you issued a press release where you said that you take the report seriously, and you said, as an organisation, we will make sure to review all the recommendations. Does that what does that mean?
So, it means what it says, Convener, and we did that, and I think, I'm sure we'll get into it, but I think, you know, I accept the recommendations and we are responding to them, and I think there's a bit of discussion about exactly what the responses look like and what I think is the best way to respond to them. But yes, I think the conclusions and the recommendations are clear, and we are, you know, keen to respond to those with colleagues around the table. Okay,
but again, just to be clear about it, the recommendations that are contained in the report set some very clear actions over the next 6 months, the next 12 months and so on. Do you intend to implement those recommendations?
Yes.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up. Could I ask Mr Anderson, from the point of view of the Oversight Board, do you have any view on whether the report is a useful contribution and you accept its findings and conclusions?
Yeah, well, firstly, I'd like to just clear up what the Oversight Board is, who we are, what we do and how we do it, because I think that was one of the confusions set out in the report. The Oversight Board is a group of around 20 people, over half of whom have direct experience of the so-called care system, but everyone has a skill set that qualifies them to do the set tasks of the board, coming from backgrounds in politics, health, education, strategic planning, and very importantly, direct support to children and families in various services across Scotland. So that's what we do. What we do is report on Scotland's progress in keeping the promise. We identify where progress has been made. And importantly, today, where barriers to change lie, and I'll hopefully go on to discuss some of that as we go on. Within the confines of possibility, without statutory powers, we hold those with responsibility to account. Again, something that I hope to do today. We also support and influence where possible. So that's what we do. Our primary audiences we report to our Parliament and the care experience community. And I was glad to hear at the last session that it was agreed that they are the people who will decide whether the promise has indeed been kept. And we also report to the workforce, because they're the ones out there delivering the true care necessary for the promise to be kept day in and day out. And we all on the Oversight Board count ourselves among the workforce, because we all do that work as well. So how do we do that? Well, we analyse data and reporting. We go out and we speak to ministers, civil servants, public bodies, organisations, small and large, to try and understand what's actually happening and to see if the reporting that we get from public bodies and government actually match what people are saying within their organisations. So some of the things that we've done recently is we've met with the Chief Executive, the Chief Social Work Officer, the outgoing one, to discuss the new National Social Work Agency and how that should align with the promised recommendations, and we have further questions to ask. We recently met with the Scotland office to discuss cross-border issues and to promote the Oversight Board as a model that could be exported, actually, to their attempts to implement the care review there. And yeah, we meet across the board to try and implement our tasks, and we do that well, I think. Regarding the Audit Scotland report, we welcomed that report, we participated in that report, and we agree with most of what's in it. around the confusion. We think that's a historical issue. We've certainly worked towards ensuring that the Independent Oversight Board is exactly that. I have prepared some evidence today that I think builds on some of the discussion from last session that I hope I get a chance to share. Because when Mr Rennick speaks about driving forward change, sometimes that car is in first gear. And when Mr Burns spoke of our calls to action, I have evidence around 2 of those, because we can't discuss everything, where action has not moved at the pace necessary. So when we speak about, and this was amplified in the report, clear leadership and working at pace, I have some stuff here that you may be interested in.
Yeah, I mean, and Mr Anderson, before we had the session with the Auditor General and the Accounts Commission, you very kindly furnished us with a note. And, I mean, you were very clear in your views in that note. And if I can take some of the expressions that we used in the first 2 paragraphs, you said, as far as the promise was concerned, things were too slow, accountability remains unclear, planning has not been coordinated, you spoke of weaknesses, lack of accountability, limited coordination, insufficient pace. So, I mean, you are quite critical, aren't you, of the progress which is being made with the promise? Yeah,
but I mean, that was around one issue.
Well, you do mention housing.
Yeah, that's the context of that. It wasn't mentioned at all. I think it was Mr Simpson who spoke of that quote from. So that was the context around that. Is it specifically around housing? There is lots of.
So they're not. Sorry, but you're saying that they're not general criticisms you're making of the implementation of the promise.
In the sense of the examples that I have. I can't speak to every aspect of the promise because it's a huge and very complex change process. But I do have evidence here that I believe backs up the assertions I made around 2 of our calls to action that I prepared today, because as I say, we can't discuss the whole promise change process. So if you would like to hear them, I can certainly give you the evidence that I believe shows.
Yeah, we will get to those. We will get to those.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I turn to our representatives from COSLA to ask if you accept the findings and recommendations of the report?
Yeah, I mean, COSLA welcomes the report and we absolutely support the direction of those recommendations. Lots of really key and critical questions have been posed and yeah, we will be continuing to work with partners around the table and others to implement those recommendations.
And I don't know whether you can answer this, but why was it that, for example, when the Audit Scotland report was published, there was a joint press release put out by COSLA, the Scottish Government, Solace as well, senior local authority officials, as well as Fiona Duncan. Why was a joint response put out? I mean, does COSLA not have any differentiating analysis of what's happened and where responsibility rests and so on?
I mean, I suppose, yeah, if you look within the sort of the detail, which I'm sure we'll come to, you know, there's nuance across our organisations, of course, in terms of our positions. But I think the intention behind, and others can keep me right, the intention behind the joint statement was to show that unity. This is still a shared commitment. We've all signed up to this, and we are working closely together to make this happen, I suppose.
Okay, because obviously there are some criticisms in the report that's been produced. And so I just wondered whether you were just all being a bit defensive of each other. Miss Dickey, you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. And I suppose just to agree with what Fiona said there in terms of COSLA's position on the report. We welcome the report. We've noted the recommendations and we've responded. COSLA's Children and Young People Board, which is our political board that looks after policy as it relates to children and young people, looked at the report in November. And gave us some of their feedback, which very much matches the recommendations that we put into Audit Scotland. In terms of a joint press release, I think that shows the maturity and the relationships that are at play here. I think it also talks an awful lot between the spheres of government, as agreed in the Verity House Agreement, where we can work in partnership, we should. I think it's fair to say that every organisation who's referenced in the report, and many of them are here today, and there are many outside of this room, have to hold themselves to account as well as each other. And I think that joint press release is in effect us saying that we're not splitting off and starting to become defensive amongst the partnerships that are involved here. We're reconvening, we're getting together, and we're demonstrating that there is will to deliver the promise in Scotland.
The Audit Scotland report does explicitly say that delivery of the promise requires a partnership approach.
Yeah, I understand that. So if that's all the case and you all accept the findings and recommendations, why are we sitting here with a letter from the independent strategic advisor, who is also, I think, Mr McKinley, the chair of Promise Scotland, with some pretty harsh criticisms of the report? I mean, she says things like the report does not provide a constructive assessment of the wider landscape, does not offer is not offering a realistic assessment of progress. I mean, that's a very harsh criticism of this report. Do you, I mean, so I don't understand how the person that chairs the Promise Scotland, who is presumably the independent strategic advisor to the Scottish Government, has got such a damning criticism. And there are two other. It's not a catalyst, she says. It should be a catalyst. So how do you reconcile that position expressed by the person who, amongst other things, is the chair of the Promise Board, and who is an advisor to the Scottish Government? Well, I'll take Mr McKinley first.
I'm happy to reply.
Thank you, Convener. So first of all, I think, as obviously members know, Fiona was invited to provide written evidence rather than being here, so she would, I'm sure...
I think she could have appeared if she'd wished to.
And
is my understanding.
And indeed, and you have that written evidence. I think, so for me, and I'm really happy to talk about this too, I think it is possible to accept the recommendations and conclusions, and also to have some views about the report that was done and how it was a bit, for me, personal view, a bit of a missed opportunity. Happy to get into that, but I think both things can coexist. I think it's okay. I think it's legitimate for the people who are subject to audit to have some views about the report that was published, and at the same time be absolutely committed to accepting the recommendations and moving the work forward. But
there is, you'll know better than most, Mr McKinley, there is a process involved in the production of one of these reports, which includes, and I think Ms Duncan refers to it in her letter of the 2nd of September, which she's kindly shared with us, where she talks about a clearance draft. So she's given commentary on a clearance draft, pre-publication, where the Auditor General in the Accounts Commission very nobly invite the organisations that they are reporting on to give them any comment, presumably fact check and so on.
Yes, that's right. So the process is that there's the fact checking process at the clearance point of view, but obviously in the end it's the Auditor General and the Accounts Commission that make the judgments in the final report. So quite often points that are made to the auditors at that stage in the process are not reflected in the final report, as you would expect as an independent audit organisation. That happens all the time. Okay.
Mr Rennick, what's your view on this?
When Audit Scotland provided oral evidence to the committee, they said themselves that they had not looked in detail at how the promise was being delivered in individual areas. So certainly from my point of view, I think it's helpful to look at the Audit Scotland report in the context of a series of other reports that have been published over the recent period, looking at the delivery within local authority areas, COSLA's own assessment, annual assessment of the promise, the report from the Oversight Board, and a range of other documents. The Diffley report that Promise Scotland published as well provides a really rich set of information about what is happening locally and nationally in terms of the delivery of promise. And I don't feel the Audit Scotland report is fundamentally inconsistent with those. I think it's helpful to see those as a set of information that provides a fuller picture of where we are in the delivery of the promise and crucially, what more we need to do in terms of delivering that. And I think the Audit Scotland report is an important part of identifying what those actions are.
Okay, one of the things which the report talks about is the confusion around governance, and I think Mr Anderson has referred to that as well in one of his submissions. And I have to say I was interested in reading the paragraphs 13 to 16 of the report, which try to explain the different hats that different people wear. But again, I know Fiona Duncan's not here, but it kind of catalogues there that She chaired the care review, which we know is a matter of public record. She became the independent strategic advisor. She chaired the oversight board up until 2024, then became the co-chair of it, held a post at the Cora Foundation, which is, as a CEO, then the strategic director, which is the body that dishes out the money, and is also, as well as being the independent strategic advisor to the government, is also the chair of Promise Scotland. I'm a little bit confused that one person has had all those roles and continues to have those roles. Again, Mr Rennick, could you explain that to us?
Yeah, I'd separate out the issue of a single individual and their role and how that role has developed, and clearly...
Well, indulge me. Talk a little bit about that as well as making wider points.
Well, as I say,
because again, this is somebody who's a government appointment, as I understand it.
My understanding, it was before my time, my understanding of the position that at the time that the promise report was published and was accepted by the Scottish Government and other partners, the Oversight Board was established as a crucial part of the oversight of that. And that was based on advice from and alongside that, an expert group made advice around the establishment of the Promise Scotland as well, drawing on the skills and experience from those that have been involved in the care review. And Fiona Duncan had a particular role within that. As the work progressed, it was identified, and again, others can talk more fully about this, it was identified that it would be better to adjust that role, and it was agreed that Fiona Duncan would become the independent strategic advisor to ministers, separate from the crucial work of the oversight board. And that's been a developing picture over time. That is separate from the governance arrangements that have been in place since the promise was established, to try and reflect the complex nature of and wide-ranging nature of the promise and the delivery of the promise.
Okay, yeah, Mr McKinley.
Thank you, Convener. I think two quick things. One is just to confirm that Fiona's role now as independent strategic advisor is that, and that also includes chairing the Promise Scotland. So those are the only roles that she now holds. I think the evolution that you can see in the report, Convener, is a product of from 2020 onwards these things being built up. And I think the other thing that's important to stress is that it was Fiona herself who identified that it was not compatible for her to both be independent strategic advisor and chair of the board of the Promise Scotland and sit on the oversight board. So it was her that said she had to step off. As the report says, that took a little bit of time, and I think she's talked a little bit about that in her letter. But this was, I think, Fiona recognising that those roles, as they developed and as the roles of the different organisations came on stream, it was clear that that wasn't really sustainable, and so she's removed that. So I absolutely recognise the points in the report about some confusion around the different groups. I mean, for the record, Convener, I should probably mention the fact that I worked for Audit Scotland for 16 years, and 10 years of that was Controller of Audit and Director of Best Value and Performance Audit. And you know, some of the complexities in that governance setup in public audit in Scotland also is quite tricky to follow. The difference between Auditor General, Controller of Audit, the Accounts Commission, and so it goes on. So I absolutely recognise and feel the point, and we have, as David said, been trying to do stuff to be really clear that while it's important that the three bits of that organisation, if you like, work closely together, that we also have really quite distinct roles, and so we will continue to work hard. I think the changes in Fiona's role has helped that, as well as some of the stuff that we've done with the Oversight Board.
Okay. Mr Anderson wants to come back in at this point.
Very quickly, when Fiona became strategic advisor, everyone on the board recognised that there were too many hats on that head, not least for her own well-being, and the decision was taken for her to step down. I personally asked Fiona to stay on for several meetings to help me to adapt to the role, because the Oversight Board is a unique model that has never been tried before, and her experience assisted me to adapt to that role. And she was in the background in those meetings, and it was there for a support for me to adapt to that new role. So just to clear up that point about why she was there so long after that, and we weren't clear about that in the minutes. Yeah, okay. Thanks for putting that on the record. That's appreciated. Did you want to come in at this point?
Please, yes. Thank you, Convener, and good morning to our guest. I just want to just clarify a little bit on this this letter that we were given sight of. First of all, I should caveat by saying there's nothing wrong with disagreeing with an Auditor General's report. If Audit Scotland have said something and you disagree with it, that's fine. But be honest about that. And unfortunately, in the opening statements, we heard phrases like, we welcome the report and the recommendations, we accept the report and the recommendations. But that's not what it says in this bit of paper. So all we're trying to do is not take a view on it, but just get to the bottom of it, of whether this organisation, the Promise Scotland Limited, does or does not accept. Because you can't come to committee and say we do accept it, but then on paper say that you don't. And clearly, this organisation, you know, it's letterheaded. It says Chair, the Promise Scotland on the back of it. So we have to take at face value that this is the view of the Promise and not simply an individual within the organisation. So which is it?
So, I tried to explain that earlier, Mr Green, when I said I think it is possible to both accept and be committed to delivering on the recommendations and responding to those, and also have some views about the Audit Scotland report. And
yeah, but that's not what it says. Let me read out what it says. In short, at worst, this report could derail Scotland's progress towards keeping the promise. That is not welcoming the report. That is not accepting the recommendations of the report, is it?
So no, it isn't. And I think, but at the same time, I don't think Fiona's letter says that she doesn't accept the recommendations and we're not going to deliver them. And you might think I'm dancing on the head of a pin there, convener. I accept that, but I think there is quite an important conversation to be had here about, you know, the nature of the report and the extent to which it is going to continue to be a catalyst for, you know, increasing that pace of change that we all recognise is required. I think what's important for me is how we go about implementing the recommendations, because that's pretty critical for me. I think the way in which we go about implementing the recommendations, which we are absolutely committed to doing, as is the Independent Strategic Advisor, I believe does have a good chance of increasing that pace and depth of change. I think if we were to do it wrong, I think it could slow things down. That was one of the points of feedback I gave to Audit Scotland through the clearance process, convener. And I think the few changes that were made in that process, I think, were helpful. But I do think how we respond to these is really critical to how the pace is increased, as opposed to potentially slowing things down.
But that's an inference then, what you've said and what is in this letter, that somehow this Audit Scotland report is slowing things down or making things worse. In fact, it explicitly says that admittedly, the clearance report, but I don't know how different the clearance report was to the final report, it will not accelerate pace of change. Instead, it risks slowing the current one. In fact, it says that the clearance draft misses to drive pace and progress. Apologies if I'm misunderstanding. It's not the job of Audit Scotland to drive pace and progress. It's the job of Audit Scotland to comment on pace and progress. Yeah, so
I'm happy to respond to that, convener. And this is me talking, not putting words in the Independent Strategic Advisor's mouth. I think my concern, and again, I promise I'll not keep banging on about the fact that I used to do this for a living, but my worry about some of the early recommendations was that when Audit Scotland and the Accounts Commission recommend that something is reviewed over a 12-month period, there's a real risk that people down tools and review things for 12 months. So my concern was that rather than cracking on with delivery, which is absolutely what we need to do, that the system would take a signal that says, right, we need to stop and review things. I think that's not what we've ended up with in the final report, and that's helpful. Okay. But I do think there was a bit of a risk.
Well, here's what I would have preferred. I would have preferred you just came in and said, look, there's stuff in this report we don't like, so I can't sign up to the report and its recommendations. And just being honest with us from the minute you walked in the door, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. There's nothing wrong with disagreeing with the Auditor General. It's finished where I start in my supplementaries here, but be honest about it. That's all we ask for.
And I have to say, I'm rather surprised at that analysis, that if you have a time frame of 12 months, it means everyone's sidetracked into doing that for 12 months. I mean, the whole basis of the promise is based on meeting a promise by 2030. So that's based on a date target, isn't it?
I think that's exactly my point, convener. Time is marching on, and we need to really focus on delivery. And my concern was that if the system... So I'll give you a concrete example, convener, if you'll permit me. I think one of the things that doesn't get a lot of mention in the report is the debate around the National Care Service. I think some of the uncertainty around the National Care Service, and in particular whether Children's Services is going to be in or out, impeded momentum around delivery of the promise, because there was an enormous amount of uncertainty. There was an enormous amount of work being done thinking about structure and change. My worry about the report sometimes is that people focus on structural reviews and rather at the expense of really focusing on delivery. So we have seen that happen in the past. That was my concern. And just very quickly to respond to Mr. Green's point, I kind of figured we would get onto some of the bits maybe in the report that we don't agree with, Mr. Green, but I do genuinely also believe that we are committed to delivering the recommendations.
Well, now I'm a bit confused because you told us earlier on you accepted the findings of the report. Now you're saying that there are elements of the findings that you don't agree with, and we're going to get into that. I mean, we're getting mixed messages here, Mr. McKinley, I think.
Well, I can only apologise for that, Convener, but I think there's some nuance in this that's worth teasing out.
Okay. Graham Simpson, I think, wants to come in on with a question around this. Graham.
Yeah, Mr. McKinley, I've got to say this letter was one of the most extraordinary letters I've seen in response to an Auditor General's report. I've really never seen anything like it. So you're not dancing on a pin. You're nowhere near the pin. You seem to be actually against, if we're to take this letter, against what the Auditor General is saying. Can I put this section in the letter to you? It says, as it stands, the lead recommendation in the clearance draft creates a significant and entirely unnecessary risk to children, families and care experienced adults. That's incredible. That is suggesting that something that the Auditor General has written is creating a risk to people. What do you mean by that? Or what does Mr. Duncan mean by that?
So, Convener, it might be helpful to get some advice, because I'm very conscious that in the interest of helping the committee's consideration, Fiona included that letter that she sent to the Auditor General, if that's what you're referring to, Mr. Simpson.
That's the letter.
Which obviously refers to not the published version, but the previous version of the report, which we don't have in front of us. So I'm conscious that might be causing a little bit of confusion. So as I said a second ago, Mr. Simpson, to their credit, Audit Scotland and the Auditor General Accounts Commission responded to some of the feedback that they received, and the version that they now have obviously was a bit different to what that letter was about.
So the published version does not create a risk to children, families and care experienced adults. Is that correct?
That's absolutely my view, yeah. Right.
So what we have is okay, but the previous version wasn't.
So again, I'll speak for myself rather than interpreting the Independent Strategic Advisor, but yes, I felt that some of the, and again we gave this feedback, that some of the recommendations were a bit problematic, and that was the feedback we gave, and through the clearance process, the Auditor General and the Accounts Commission changed some of that.
Well, what about the sentence that Mr. Green referred to earlier, where it says, in short, at worst, the report that was published could derail Scotland's progress towards keeping the promise? That's quite a claim. Why do you make that?
So again, I would say that what's really important is how we respond to the recommendations, and I think there is a way of responding to the recommendations which will not result in that eventuality, Mr. Simpson. So, and I'm confident that, as we've said already, given the strength of the partnership that there exists, and to your point, Convener, that of course there are tensions and disagreements amongst the parties. That's part of the work. But I think we are absolutely confident that, you know, building on these recommendations and all the other stuff that the Director General spoke about, that we will get on and deliver.
But sorry, how on earth can a report from the Auditor General derail progress towards keeping the promise? That's just not possible.
So you can argue about the language, I suppose, Mr. Simpson, but I think, well, you know better than anyone, the power of these reports is significant, and I think, depending on how people respond to them, they can either increase pace and delivery, or they can, I think, create
But how can it
some issues in
how
delivery.
can a report from the Auditor General derail progress? These reports are about, making progress.
So I tried to explain my view on that to the convener, Mr Simpson. You may not agree with that, but as I say, my concern is that sometimes when recommendations are about reviewing things, that some inertia can creep into the system that can derail progress.
So your view, as expressed today, was the danger is if we start reviewing things, people, so they almost down tools on doing other work. I must say I found that comment extraordinary, as well as the comments in this letter. Let me ask you this: why is Ms Duncan not here today? She was given the chance.
Well, I'll take full responsibility for that, convener. Sorry, Mr Simpson, because I thought that because she wasn't specifically invited, I was invited to come to the committee. She was invited to give written evidence. I could have brought her along as an additional person. That felt a bit odd, to be honest, given that she chaired the Independent Care Review and she's the Independent Strategic Advisor. So I clearly misread the committee's intentions with that invitation, and also, there was a size of the panel thing. So I take full responsibility for that. I'm sure as she's watching this, she'll be thinking exactly the same thing.
I'm sure she will. And you know the way this committee works. And if we've got a letter like this in front of us, we're going to ask about it. So, you're reflecting on it.
Yeah, and again, just for the record, the letter was lodged with us on the 1st of December. So, it not only attaches the September letter about the pre-publication review, the clearance draft. It does also reinforce the views that were in that September letter in a 1st of December letter, where she makes it quite clear. I mean, expressions are used like although I agree with several of the recommendations, overall I believe both the performance audit and the subsequent report are missed opportunities. Anyway, I'm going to invite Colin Beattie to put some questions to you.
Thank you, Convener. You'll be pleased to know I won't refer to the letter. I'm looking, though, at governance and implementation, which is clearly an area that's been shown to have certain weakness. There seems to be no doubt that members and organisations are all committed to the promise. That does seem sure. However, the Auditor General's report makes it clear that there's a lack of consistent and shared understanding of what delivering the promise would look like and how that would be achieved by 2030. And there seems to be no real shared understanding of what the promise is in some ways, or how it's going to be delivered, or the different organisations seem to have different nuances in this. So what's being done to enable that shared understanding of what the promise means across these different organisations?
There's been a range of work, Mr Beattie, there's been a range of work since the promise was committed to back in 2020. Part of that work has been identifying specific actions that have needed to be taken to deliver the promise. So, for example, the action that was taken through legislation and operational work to no longer send under-18s to young offenders institutions. So there's a specific bit of work that required action, and there are a range of other ones in that way that we can talk about. There was a set of work that was around changing the culture at national and local level to commit to focusing on the love and support of young people. And there were a set of actions that were around more systemic change within the system and local change at a local level through the Children's Services Plan and Children's Services Planning partnerships. So there were a number of different strands of work that were identified and have been progressed since 2020. The Scottish Government published its own implementation plan for that in 2022, and again that was updated in 2024. the Promise Scotland also developed the Promise story that sets out a number of specific areas for assessing whether the promise is being delivered, and that really focuses on those three key areas. Does the care community feel the impact of the promise is being kept? How are organisations working to deliver the promise? And how is Scotland as a whole, at a national level, delivering the promise? And we have tried to focus on those three different levels in terms of describing the progress that we're making, but others may wish to come in on that.
But the comments about complicated accountability, multiple routes of governance, these are not good comments to have. How can you implement policies if there's different frameworks and different guidance across that network that you're trying to deliver through?
Yeah, and again, it reflects something that Audit Scotland said in their report and to the committee, that the promise is not a single programme. It's not the delivery of a single programme in government or a single project. It's a whole set of interventions and activities, and that cuts across a range of governance arrangements. So there are, as you've discussed, specific governance arrangements around the promise. There are local governance arrangements around delivery and local authorities. There are arrangements around decisions on housing are taken. There are arrangements around decisions on health. And it's about ensuring that that commitment to the promise is spread across all of those areas in governance decisions, and that is the only way that we can respond to the actual lives and needs of children and young people and families.
Doesn't that risk a huge element of fragmentation?
I mean, what it tries to draw that together, and the work of the Promise Scotland and the Oversight Group tries to do, is make sure that that is underpinned by a shared commitment to delivering the promise that draws that range of activity together. But you're right, we are counting on a range of individual decisions at a local and national level helping to deliver the promise. But I know that Nicola wanted to...
I don't think what's been said in the report actually reflects on the commitment of different organisations to delivering. It's perhaps more a common understanding of what the target, I don't know, targets are wrong, but to get the outcomes that are required in these different areas, there has to be some sort of common understanding, some sort of common policy, some sort of common approach, even with the diverse units you're dealing with.
Yeah, and again, colleagues and I can talk a little bit about the Promise Progress framework that was published in 2024, and that was based on a set of vision statements and then specific outcomes and indicators. And those weren't, for the most part, weren't new things that we weren't measuring already and weren't already reflected in our work programme, but drawing them together into a single document specifically related to the promise to try and provide that clarity of the outcomes that we're looking at, how we're going to measure those.
But again, the Auditor General's report draws attention to the Scottish Government's efforts to streamline the governance and accountability. But the changes have not yet been achieved. So what is being done? What is the reason that we haven't made that progress that's needed?
I suppose what I would say is there has clearly been progress made, and I can talk about that both in terms of specific actions, in terms of some really impressive work at local level as well. So I can talk about what has been progressed and delivered. I think what has been happening over that time is a further refined understanding of what is required to deliver the promise and how we ensure the structures are both overseeing and monitoring that progress, and that has been refined over time. It was reflected in the initial work around establishing the Oversight Board. It was reflected in our 2022 implementation plan that those elements needed to be built in, and those have been developed and refined over the period of the promise. And I'm sure we'll continue to do that as we move to 2030. We'll continue to refine.
We're moving in 2026 with the supposed delivery date of 2030. All we see so far, according to the General's report, is how slow the progress has been. So, why?
I think I mentioned, again, I know that colleagues from COSLA want to come in, will have insights as well. I think I mentioned earlier some of the headwinds that we had that we have faced, and again, the committee is really familiar with those in terms of the impact of COVID, the cost of living crisis, a whole range of pressures. The needs at local level are becoming increasingly complex in terms of mental health. Needs. There's been an increase in the number of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children that we've had as well, and both at local and national level we've had to respond to those. There has also been, we would always want faster progress in terms of this. I think there's a consistent message across the Audit Scotland report, around the reports that local government and the Promise have published, and our own report, that there is more to do and faster to do in terms of fully achieving that, keeping the promise by 2030. So I wouldn't deny that I would like us to have made more progress, and that we are going to have to significantly increase the pace of activity jointly to meet the commitment by 2030.
Colin, I think Nicola Dickey wants to come in, and David Anderson wants to come in as well. But
yes, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to kind of contribute. I've got an awful lot of sympathy for the auditor. This is a whole system, highly complex position that we are trying to deliver over a 10-year period. It's not it was one of the first. It won't be the last. I suspect our audit colleagues are turning their attention to things like the Population Health Framework, which are 10-year programmes that sit in all different bits of the system. So please take those comments as this is an incredibly complex area, and it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. I think we're starting to use some words quite interchangeably, and I think they're different things. I think delivery is absolutely around about voice and around about how individual organisations are being held to get held collectively to account on the way they are delivering. I think an awful lot of the organisations that are represented here and those sitting outside are responsible for delivering policy, developing policy, passing legislation, making political decisions, and there's an accountability attached with that. So delivery is one thing. I don't need to tell you. So the Auditor General's report is trying to do all of those things at once. I think there are other tensions within what we're doing. We could have come in with a project plan that had green, low risk, everything's on message, but if the voice, which is the promise, doesn't feel that on the ground. So what I'm saying is there are tensions here between national organisations that are accountable, national organisations that are attempting to monitor what is happening in individual areas or organisations. COSLA is a membership organisation. We do not scrutinise our member councils, but we are trying to bring that evidence to bear. So I suppose I appreciate the complexity in that, and I think as we move towards other programmes that are over the longevity of 10 years, we will need some really kind of careful understanding of that. But I suppose ultimately the promise was very clear at the start when the promise was put in, and I agree with Director General in terms of the system that the promise landed in terms of COVID and cost of living. But ultimately, the promise was a non-traditional way to approach a set of changes and outcomes that we were looking for. So there is a balance to be struck about traditional governance with project plans and project management and all of that, and how it actually feels. And I think some of that tension is what's coming through today.
David, did you want to come in on that? Or?
Yeah, I'm glad to hear the mention of the pace of change, because the evidence I prepared with regards to that, some government, I mean, this is a complex change process, but sometimes it's very easy to put the changes in place. And the pace of change that I'll speak about here is a great example of how things could have been different and should have been different. And there are direct lines of responsibility for that, Mr Rennick. So I'm glad that you're here, because you'll go on to make decisions in your job over the next 5 years, hopefully to make sure that the promise is kept. So I provided evidence around housing, and in particular the care leavers pathway, which was agreed by government back in 2019, and that was recommendations that were agreed by COSLA, across the sector, you know, experts in their fields, and the then Minister said that they would implement that, a guarantee. In 2020, there was a government update that recommitted to that. In 2021, the recommendations said that housing was essential to the promise being kept. In 2022, the government paused that pathway. They paused it quietly, without explanation. In our report, when we realised that, and we didn't pluck this out of thin air, we had experts in the field, on the board, people with direct experience of working with people who experience homelessness and housing issues, and people who had experienced it themselves. And we asked for that pathway to be reinstated. We didn't get a response. We then wrote to the Minister for Housing, Paul McLennan. I think at the time we got a response that told us what the government were doing, but not that they would reinstate the pathway. We didn't agree with that, so we asked to speak with the Director General, Gavin, and he came in to meet us, and bizarrely he asked us what the pathway would do that what the government wasn't doing at present. And well, given that homeless applications for care experience people were rising by 15% at that time, I felt that that question was the wrong way around. So we didn't agree with his assertion that things were going well. We asked him to take it to the subcommittee for the promise, which was in May. We don't know if he did because he didn't get back to us. So, and there's no minutes to that meeting because I checked. And we then met with the Minister for the Promise, who came in the same month, and we asked her about the pathway. She didn't know it had been paused. She was unclear about the wording, because this seems to be quite an important aspect for government, is wording. And she turned to her advisor, who was Mr Henderson, and he didn't seem to clear the matter up. In fact, it was Fraser who stepped in to confirm that the pathway had been paused. So we terminated that conversation because it wasn't going anywhere. I asked several months after that whether things were happening. Nothing was happening. We eventually got a letter again from Mr Watson saying that what the government doing was adequate, and he referred to a report by the Rock Trust that came out just in that October. Now, we'd read that report, and it did not demonstrate enough was being done. Only half of local authorities responded to the survey, and for 3 of the recommendations there were no responses at all. So really it wasn't much use in terms of giving a clear picture. But also noted an 8% decrease since 2022 in the proportion of areas that had arrangements in place to prevent young people leaving care. Despite those concerns, the letter presented the situation almost as a reassurance, noting, for example, that while homelessness is rising, youth homelessness is rising more slowly. So for a group that had been given specific commitments, I don't think that brought any comfort. And we have live examples of young people who have been in care not for 3 months, 4 months, but for years, who put housing applications in as recommended 2 years before they leave. And what were they offered? Homelessness accommodation. And when pressure was brought to bear on that situation, they were taken to a flat, and what did they see when they opened the door? Mould on the walls. Now, I know that is far removed from the lives of the people who have got their hands on the levers of power, but that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to change that. And that kind of delay and drift around this issue is just unacceptable. Now, I didn't accept that. An oversight board believed that there was more that could be done, so I wrote to the Director for Housing, the Director for Social Justice, and I said, we're going to be critical in our report about this issue. And lo and behold, we got a response. I am confident that we will be able to find the resources to progress further the homelessness prevention pathway for care leavers. As a first step, I'll look to arrange a meeting to discuss this work in areas we would best focus on and prioritise. Now, for me, that would be to go out and look in local authorities, identify which kids were transitioning or were in homeless accommodation, and sort that issue out straight away with those resources. That wasn't the case. What the answer was to create another subgroup. Now, I know this is quite a common government response to problems, but it certainly doesn't answer the questions on the ground. So, OK, we accepted that, and I was quite positive in my media communications about this. We got some movement from government on this. Taken a long time, but we didn't want, because we're here to support the government. We're here to support every corporate parent that is trying to make this change. But we have to tell the truth. Did that subgroup meet that month? Did they meet the next month? Did they meet the month after? No, they didn't. In May, there was, Barnardo's received £18 million, and they're going to develop 50 gap homes across the UK, 5 in Scotland. That was great news. I instantly said to Fraser, can we speak to them to see how we can support them, see what they need to be supported by the government team, a promise team that's supposed to help deliver the promise. Did the government contact them? No. We asked what they needed support. We then met with the Gap Homes lead. We then organised a meeting with all the third sector providers to get a set of asks for government to see how they could progress in a moment of crisis. So the focus should have been on it, what they could do to help. Had that subgroup met? No. When did it meet? I had to meet with the Permanent Secretary and raise these issues with him. When we learned that there was a new Permanent Secretary, we raised it to that level to say this delay is unacceptable. We got an assurance from him that it would be dealt with. And lo and behold, there was a meeting, there was a subgroup, and there will be an action plan by the end of this month. That's 2 years of unnecessary intervention by an oversight board that is not responsible for doing that. And if you had listened at the outset, that wouldn't have happened. And I've got an even better example for you. I won't go into it. I'll let you. I'll let you.
The clock's militating against us a bit. You've given us a very, very clear example with the homelessness pathway example. And if we've got time, we can come to another example. But I'm going to ask Colin. Colin, have you got further questions to put?
Well, the last question I was going to ask really was what has to happen over the next 4 years or so to deliver the promise, and how the work's going to be prioritised through the various organisations. It sounds like there's an awful lot of work to be done internally to smooth the pathways that are needed here. So I'll leave it at that for the moment, Convener.
OK, thank you. I mentioned earlier on that one of the committee members, Joe Fitzpatrick, is contacting us, or is putting his questions through via the video link. And I'm now going to turn to Joe and invite him to put some questions to you. Joe.
Well, thank you, Convener. I'm almost wanting to change my questions after hearing the points from David to Colin's questions, but I'm going to try and shift a little bit. Most of what David was talking about there was responsibilities around the Scottish Government and how the Scottish Government has interacted. And obviously, I'm really keen that we all recognise that the promise was not just the Scottish Government, it was the Scottish Government and other public bodies, and actually a promise from the whole of Scotland that we all need to make sure we're keeping. So keen to hear how we're managing to get the joined up working that is required. So I'd be keen to hear from COSLA whether they think there is the correct engagement across local authorities, but also maybe starting with COSLA as well, and then we'll maybe hear from David again about what the experience from his perspective is. Whether COSLA, the local authorities are managing to get the engagement that they require with Scottish Government, but also with other significant public authorities such as the local NHS. So I don't know if Nicola or Fiona want to come in first.
Absolutely. So, sorry, are you meaning engagement in terms of within sort of children's strategic partnerships, or more nationally, just to confirm?
Sorry, what I mean is that on a local level, are we managing to get the people who are all committed to the promise to be working together? The promise can't be delivered in a whole lot of silos. It can only be delivered if we all work as effectively Team Scotland to deliver something that we've all promised. We're all committed to this. I haven't heard anybody saying that they aren't committed to the promise. So we can't do it in isolation. So are we managing to break down the barriers which have sometimes made such a joined up piece of work more difficult? Are local authorities experiencing that change? Are they managing to work not just with the Scottish Government, not just across their own portfolios, but with big organisations like the NHS?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for that question. And I think you've sort of touched on a really key pivotal part of the promise. And I do think that's something that is a real strength, and something that the promise has done really well is articulate that joint responsibility and the role that all partners play. So I think, we've known for a long time that corporate parenting responsibilities sit with a large range of partners, but I think the promise really helped move that forward in terms of how we're working together locally. So, I mean, within any sort of change of this scale, there's always going to be challenges, but broadly speaking, what we hear from local areas is that they are getting together, getting on board, and that they're working collaboratively. Obviously, that, as I say, that has its challenges within different areas, but broadly speaking, you know, people are around the table. Often that's done through children's strategic partnerships. I know at the sort of previous session, when you'd spoken with the Auditor General, there was mention of the evaluation of CSP plans from 23-26. I know that there was mention that the promise only appeared or it was only a strategic priority, I think, in 15 of them. I suppose what I would point out is that when the evaluation looked at what all the strategic priorities were, the promise or care experience was the 5th one, but the top 4 were actually, you know, children's rights was the first one. Child protection and safety, was the first one. Children's rights and voice, the second one. Mental health was the 3rd most commonly mentioned, and the 4th was child poverty and inequalities. So all of that, while not specifically the promise, I would say contributes to the promise and improving the lives of care experienced people. So I think we need to be clear about the sort of wider ambitions of the promise and how all of that connects in terms of supporting children, but their families and their wider communities as well. So, you know, those plans are developed collaboratively with partners. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make is there's clearly joint agreement and sign up and commitment to that. And, you know, the other report I'd probably mention as well was the local perspectives report, which I think was mentioned earlier. And that is over 500 pages of examples of work that is happening locally, often through local authorities, but not all of the examples are exclusively local authority examples. Some of them are examples of joint pieces of work with partners, whether that's third sector, health boards, like you said, or others. So I don't know if Nicola wants to add anything to that.
Just maybe briefly to say, I think what Fiona's articulated there is what's working really well at a local level. I think what we have to recognise is that there is a whole public service reform agenda, and I appreciate the Auditor General can't put everything in the report, but sometimes it can be quite distracting at a local level if things are changing en masse at a national level. We won't go back into the National Care Service discussion, it's been mentioned a couple of times, but a real kind of focus, you know, if we think about another big part of our public sector is policing reform programmes moving on. So I think we've got to be mindful that there's enough flexibility in what other parts of the public sector and local government and indeed wider third sector partners can do at a local level, and be aware that there are a lot of moving parts at a national level. And I suppose that's probably one of the things that we spend a lot of time helping our colleagues inside of government. The example that you raised, David, around about housing and homelessness. Until the promise is everybody's business, we're always going to have to be deliberate in reminding our colleagues who are delivering homelessness policy nationally or indeed locally that they are corporate parents. So my gut feeling is that all of the organisations who are working in a local area understand their corporate responsibilities as corporate parents, but the system is incredibly busy and we don't want to slow down the progress we've made so far, but we absolutely need to be mindful in the next 5 years the public services in Scotland are going to change. So as we change the governance arrangements that are referenced in the report, we need to be mindful of future-proofing that we don't upset the local partnerships that are working well.
And are you confident that even where the promise isn't specifically a clear priority in a local authority area, as in written down, that it still is at the fore, and it has been, when we're talking about changes to policing, you know, the promise is still being remembered and not just put to the side?
That's certainly my sense, looking at it from a strategic perspective. I mean, local government itself has kind of 3 main areas that we have for governance. Not to go back to the governance conversation, but we have the Children and Young People Board in COSLA, we all 32 represented, and other public sector bodies sitting there, including public health, our heads of education. We've got lots of professionals there. We've got the Local Government Promise Programme, and then we've got the Promise Leads Network. Fiona's referenced the children's services stuff, and we've also got good oversight into the community planning partnerships and also the Community Planning Improvement Board, which is the national body that supports what happens at a local level. So yeah, I'm really confident that local authorities and their partners at a local level understand their requirements as corporate parents for the promise.
Okay, thanks. I wonder if Andrew or Gavin want to maybe add a little bit around this. There's obviously a lot of shared responsibilities.
Yeah, Convener, I'm happy to add to that from my own perspective. I think one observation is that I see day in, day out that partnership working between local governments, Scottish governments and the Promise and other partners. So it's a fact of life in terms of our delivery of the Promise, just to give the committee that assurance. That's what I see happening at team level and also at senior level. We do have a range of governance. To go back to the governance point from earlier, it can look complicated, and I think there is a commitment from all of us to streamline that going forward. An observation would be that if you consider the Promise to be a pretty wide portfolio of activity within which there are some particular projects and programmes, sometimes you need to put particular governance around a project or programme for a while. So the example in my mind is the work on the Whole Family Wellbeing programme. So we established some specific governance around that programme. That programme is now well underway, and I've taken steps to integrate the governance for that programme with 2 other programmes within government. So I think there's definitely a shared sense of purpose around streamlining. We also have at senior level a good opportunity to bring together the chairs of the different governance boards from Promise Scotland, local government and Scottish Government. And that's a forum, I guess, for us to look across the piece between the 3 different partner organisations. So, again, to say that there are some positive steps there in relation to our shared governance. A final comment, I think, would be looking at some of the leadership responsibilities that I personally have, chairing a range of groups with wider partners. The strategy we've tended to take is to co-chair groups, key groups of leaders across the public sector. So it's not just Scottish Government chairing and guiding the discussions. You know, I chair a couple of key bodies with partners from COSLA and Solace, for example. So we are very much doing that in partnership together.
Okay, thanks for that. That all sounds really good. David, do you want to add your comments on it's what we're hearing there?
Obviously, in our report, we encouraged COSLA and Scottish Government to work well together, because historically there has always been a kind of tennis table back and forth of responsibility on certain issues when it gets difficult, and we believe that the Promise calls for shared ownership of concrete plans with a timescale for actions. Just on to repeat the housing issue, we received the latest COSLA report on progress for the Promise, and we appreciate that, and we recognise the commitment it expresses to keeping the Promise and all the good work that's going on. But on housing, COSLA highlights positive examples: transition flats, aftercare hubs, dedicated housing support. But these are isolated snapshots. There's no evidence that comparable support is available in every local authority, or that care experienced young people can rely on consistent access to safe, stable homes. And more importantly, there didn't seem to be much housing data in that report. How many care experienced young people become homeless? How many spend time in temporary accommodation? How many supported tenancies exist in local authorities? And as we go on in our reporting, fulfilling our reporting, we're going to get into more detail. And we've never separated local authorities. We've always spoken about COSLA. But as time goes on, and if the Promise isn't being kept and there are barriers to change, then we have to become more and more specific about where those problems lie.
Thanks for that. That was actually going to be my next question, as to whether you were able to start doing that, so that we as politicians can make sure we're putting pressure in the right place. But if you've got that hand, that sounds good. So thanks very much. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks very much. I'm going to move things straight along by inviting Graham Simpson to put some questions to you. Graham.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I think it'll be quite quick, really. I just want to find out where we are with establishing a measurement framework. That would be a framework for measuring progress. So anyone can answer that.
I'll bring in Gavin Henderson, although it's a joint framework in terms of the Promise Progress framework.
Yes, so in December last year we published the Promise Progress Framework, and that was a piece of work published jointly with the Scottish Government, COSLA and the Promise Scotland. And the intention here was to bring together a common framework with outcome statements which clarify in specificity what the change that the Promise is looking to achieve, and the measurement indicators that we will judge ourselves by being delivered. That was published. It's still a bit of a work in progress of December last year. There's an update coming next week. we've published on that, and that is one of 3 parts of the wider Promise Story of Progress package, which sits alongside the work on how organisations are delivering change, as well as how the care community is experiencing change.
So there's an update due next week. So they're not a final version of the framework.
So I think it'll be an ongoing process of developing the statistical indicators and data. The publication from last year included data across a range of different areas, setting out really transparently where the progress has been so far from 2020 through to 2024. Update on material next week on that. I mean, the wider point here is that I would say that the government is being quite transparent and open about the measurements by which we will hold ourselves accountable for keeping the promise by 2030. And it's not just the government, obviously, it's across the system. So when I think Mr. Beattie asked earlier, what is the promise trying to achieve? These statements set out in real crystal clarity some of those things. So, for example, keeping more families together where that's safe, and that will reduce the number of children that are in compulsory care, reducing the number of exclusions of care experienced children in schools, reducing the number of restraints that are happening in residential childcare, and so on. And it's a cross-portfolio package that's not just about the core care system, but about a wider range of measures that include mental health and drugs issues for care leavers up to the age of 25 as well. So I'd encourage you to review that as well.
I mean, why is it taking so long to get this framework in place? And next week, all we're getting is an update. When are we actually going to have this?
So what we published last year is the thing. The figures and numbers will be updated through regularly through to 2030 to have a real-time measurement about how we're delivering against the promise. What we published last year wasn't a partial document, it was a complete statement of the measurement framework which we will hold ourselves to deliver against. What it does have gaps in are indicator sets where we don't yet have the data points that we agreed were necessary in order to do that. So, for example, Public Health Scotland, we're working with them to develop data sets which will measure health indicators for care experienced young people, which are currently not collected.
Yeah, I mean, one of the gaps, as referenced in the Auditor General's report, is that the current framework, I'm just quoting from the report, doesn't capture the experiences of care experienced people or the workforce. So will the next iteration of the framework do that?
So the experience of the care community is part of a separate piece of work that is intended to be published next week as well, as part of the Promise Stories of Progress package.
That's a yes. Is that a yes?
Yeah. Thank you. Very, very briefly, Mr. Sims. So the answer is yes. The idea was always that the story of progress, which is the overarching name we give for the measurement framework, has 3 components. I think Neil mentioned them earlier. The progress framework that Gavin's just described is out there, has been out there for 12 months, and it's the kind of national tracker, if you like, across a whole range of different vision statements and outcomes. And that's really important. Just very briefly, I'll give an example, because it includes things like the number of children in temporary housing and temporary accommodation in Scotland, because I think our proposition that's shared is that for as long as we've got 10,000 children in Scotland living in temporary housing, the promise is going to be harder to keep. So while it's not about the care system per se, it is a really important indicator that we think needs to be progressed. Alongside that, then, the work that's been happening this year is to develop how we go about measuring the experience bit of it, the kind of qualitative part of the framework, and the third element is around organisational progress. Those second 2 are due for publication next week. But I think, just to be clear, Mr. Simpson, the whole idea of this way of measuring is that it will continue to evolve and be updated on an ongoing basis. It's not that we publish it this year and then everyone steps away from it. The work will continue into 2026 and indeed all the way through to 2030. The idea being that, you know, on a regular basis, on an annual basis, people can go into that framework and get a sense of and understand the progress that's been made in keeping the promise.
Mr Anderson.
Very briefly, from an Oversight Board perspective, our next report will focus on care experience voice, because we understand it's time to hear their voice and determine if there's a kind of general opinion on how the promise is being kept to the different groups that make up that community.
When's that due out?
That will be due next year, but we also have a parliamentary event in February, and we'll be updating on various other aspects of the promise to keep it in the minds of MSPs before the election. So I hope to see you all there. It's February the 26th.
Well, hopefully we can all make it. Sounds like it'll be a good one. I'll leave it there, convener.
Okay, thank you very much. We've now got a final round of questions from the Deputy Convener. Jamie, over to you.
Thank you, convener, and thank you for your responses to our questions thus far. So I'm going to try and just pick up some of the areas that we've covered, and also just to give you as the panel the opportunity to make sure that you feel like you've left the session having said everything you think you need to in this public session. But I'll maybe reflect on the example that was given by Mr Anderson as Chair of the Oversight Board around the issue of housing, and clearly raised a practical example of how the promise is not being kept, essentially. And I think it's useful to talk in the specifics of this issue. But I guess I would simply ask the government, is, based on that example, what is the point of having this new model of oversight of the board, which is clearly a new way of doing things? It's attached to the promise, if you like, but independent enough to critique progress or otherwise. But what is the point of having an independent oversight group if the government does not react to or respond to the warnings that it is given? And we had a classic example of 2 years of dithering and delay to respond to a very specific problem that could have made a huge difference to a cohort of young people.
I'm really pleased that you've asked that question, because it was something that I was wanting to try and come back on, and I really appreciate the level of challenge from David and the Oversight Board. That is their job, to challenge us and to ensure that we are all responding to those issues. I'll let Gavin or Andrew answer in terms of some of the work that has been happening in terms of the pathways that David mentioned and the engagement with housing colleagues. But I think, as David said, there are some fantastic examples of this being delivered at a local level. I recently visited a project in Midlothian that is working with 16 to 26-year-olds leaving the care system, ensuring that they have permanent housing solutions, not just providing a flat, but ensuring that they've got a cohort of peer support, painting and decorating the flat, access to support and ongoing advice and help. So there are fantastic examples across different local authorities. What they said to me was that absolutely housing is a significant challenge, not just in terms of care experienced people, but more broadly. And what they have tried to do is not ignore the wider challenges that is facing the housing system in their local authority area, but try to work with their housing partners, try to work with the local authority. And that was the best way of ensuring that they could get access to housing, but also the support of the local community in the decisions that they were taking around prioritisation. And that was a really good example of where there's a wider challenge across a number of local authorities, but a local solution to try and respond to that.
It is, but it was also a really good example of when the Oversight Group goes to ministers and civil servants at the most senior level and said, we have a problem here, this policy has been paused, and nothing happened.
So that's not the local authority's fault. Andrew and Gavin, and I would be hugely disappointed if nothing happened. You are all more aware than I am around this table of the wider housing challenges that Scotland individual areas are facing. There's a huge amount of work and effort going into that, and the needs of care experienced young people and the needs of young people generally are a key priority in that work. So it is not the case that is not identified and being reflected. But I don't know if Andrew or Gavin wanted to say any more about the discussions around that.
Yeah, I mean, happy to add to that. I mean, just I suppose first point of assurance around this particular example is that, because I was at one of the meetings that David referenced in his chronology there, is that when these issues are raised with us in terms of the promise, absolutely we do act on that and raise them with other parts of government that have the direct responsibility for those policy areas. And I can recall very clearly some of the discussions that David mentions, and very clearly my action after that was immediately to raise that with the housing area in terms of what was happening. I think in terms of the overall government position on this, absolutely, as Neil says, do not underestimate the challenges around housing and homelessness now. We have the national emergency and a number of local emergencies as well. So I think we'd want to give further assurance the government is very seriously looking at these questions. I think in the timeline that David set out, that the other, I guess, element of this recently has been the Parliament scrutiny of the housing bill and some of the discussions around that, the duties to act and ask in that space, and that's maybe another conversation, but there's clearly been progress around the housing bill as well. I think the last point I'd maybe make is that in terms of our governance structures and our accountability around the promise, we have the Cabinet Subcommittee on the promise. Recently heard from the Cabinet Secretary for Housing, who was able to give the subcommittee assurances about progress in this area. There's more work to be done, but I do think there's been that guarantee offered within government from the portfolio leading this work that they will be looking at this and taking it forward through the subgroup that David mentioned, but through our wider programme of activity as well.
Do you say progress has been made? I mean, since the promise was first made, a third of councils in Scotland have declared a housing emergency. In the briefings we've got from COSLA and Shelter Scotland, they state that nearly 17,000 children are homeless in Scotland, over 10,000 are in temporary accommodation. Does that sound like we're meeting the promise for those 17,000 children? It doesn't sound like it to me.
Well, I think I would probably agree with the comments that Fraser McKinlay made earlier around this is, a key area of action that we need to address in order to keep the promise. So, I mean, I would absolutely agree that the numbers that you mentioned there present a significant challenge. The government and partners are looking to address that. It's not straightforward, but I think the government has set out the level of its commitment in this area. That is not all to do with the promise. It's a much broader issue, as you know. But from our perspective in relation to keeping the promise, we will do all that we can to make sure that these particular questions are prioritised in that broader piece of work.
Thank you. Can I move on to COSLA whilst you're here? We obviously received a letter from COSLA just 2 days ago ahead of the session. I appreciate you didn't write the letter, but again, it's one of these, it's got your logo on the top of it, so I'm going to ask you about it. It was actually from Councillor Buchanan, who's your children and young person spokesperson. And he made the valid point that local authorities make annual budget decisions within the confines of the funding arrangements that councils work to. But he then went on to say COSLA cannot comment on gaps within each of our 32 councils, which sort of leads me to beg the question is what is the point of COSLA in this field if you have a commitment to meet the promise and can only talk in the generality of what local authorities do, but are unwilling to criticise individual councils, clearly? Because that's the impression I'm getting, is that if there are specific failures in specific parts of Scotland, which we know there are, COSLA seems quite unwilling or reticent to unearth what those local failings actually are, because ultimately it's local delivery that will meet the local needs of people, isn't it?
So I absolutely recognise. I mean, I suppose there are two issues I would make. We do not scrutinise our councils. We've got lots of organisations in the room who that is their primary function to scrutinise and assure, and obviously the electorate scrutinises our local authorities. So I think we are a membership organisation, but I don't know that criticism is the easiest way to change practice. So I think what you've heard this morning is in and around about collaboration. It's in and around about supporting individual local authorities to improve their performance, and publicly criticising people doesn't always get you the best. From COSLA's perspective, we will go alongside individual local authorities, be it in and around about the promise, delayed discharge, housing and homelessness, and we will find out what those actual issues are. In terms of turning to the finances, one of the things about the promise finance and how much has or has not been invested is it's almost impossible to find and follow what all of the totality of the investment that local government makes that benefits people who are care experienced, or indeed getting it right for every single child. So I think one of the challenges we have is, if you said to me, could I go round the 32 and give you the pounds and pence, what they're short or what they require? No, I couldn't. And if I could, that would probably suggest there were silos within individual local authorities that meant that we were not getting a whole system approach. What I would say is that the COSLA manifesto for the upcoming Scottish Parliament elections, and indeed COSLA's lobbying campaign, is absolutely clear that a strong settlement for local government in Scotland is an investment in our communities. And given that care experienced children and adults live in communities the length and breadth of Scotland, that's the most powerful thing that we can do. Whole family support funding has come up a couple of times on the periphery here. £500 million is a welcome investment. £500 million invested in the local government settlement without any ring fence, and the flexibility to deliver that for individual councils and communities across Scotland is where COSLA is at the moment.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, I got your manifesto asks the other day. I mean, it's interesting because you're saying it's very difficult to quantify how short councils are to be able to deliver the promise, but we have very specific asks from COSLA, and it's not a small amount of cash that's been asked. £16 billion inflationary uplift to presumably the block grant funding, £750 million for social care, which COSLA claims would increase the social worker workforce by over 19,000. I'm going to come on to workforce in a moment. £844 million to the capital grant, and another nearly £1 billion to the affordable housing supply, which may address some of these housing issues. I mean, Mr Rennick, I imagine you don't have £18 billion sloshing around your coffers at the moment, but do you see the point that if local councils aren't properly funded, there's no way on earth we'll deliver the promise by 2030?
Yeah, there'll be an ongoing dialogue between local and national government. I think, as Nicola says, it's really crucial to understand the promise in the context of specific bits of funding that we provide. I think that the whole family wellbeing funding is a really great example. When I go around the country and speak to local authority colleagues, they are using that to provide some really innovative projects, real variety in terms of what's being delivered with that, and a lot of flexibility in terms of how that money is being used. But we also need to think of it in the context of the bigger mainstream budgets that we have for local government, for health, for justice, etc. So, yeah, it's how we make use of the totality of funding. I suppose the other thing that I would say is part of the message of the promise was around about how we shift resources, so not just additional resources, but how we make sure that we are shifting resources towards prevention so that we don't need to spend money further down the line in terms of responding to the crisis when it arises.
Let's talk about the whole family wellbeing fund. It was £500 million was promised. How much of it has been spent?
148 million so far.
And when will the rest of it be?
It's spread over the coming period. Part of that reflects discussions with our partners about when they'll be ready to spend that money. But Andrew and Gavin, I don't know if you wanted to say any more about that.
Yeah, so we set out the kind of latest approach on whole family in the Promise Implementation Plan update that I think Neil mentioned earlier, published in 2024. And that set out, as Neil says, this point about the feedback from delivery partners, but also families around that need for a longer-term approach to the funding and to the support. However, I think in looking at this in the current period, very mindful that with the election coming up, there are some challenges about pre-committing too far into the future. So what we have done is set out a timeline which will be used to make those decisions about the profile of future funding over those years, based very much on the cycle of evaluation around the impact of years 1, 2 and subsequently 3 and 4 of the programme.
Where did this £500 million get plucked from? I mean, who said, oh, that's how much we need to deliver the promise? Because it sounds a very arbitrary number. And it also sounds, reading the Audit Scotland report, that the government has absolutely no idea where that money has been effective in delivering what it has to. I mean, it's impossible to follow the money, virtually. So before you spend another £250 million, how confident can you be that the money will be well spent?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of remarks on that. So I think in terms of the impact of the funding, I mentioned a second ago the role of evaluation in that. So I think one of the findings from the year 1 evaluation was that local partnerships, because the money goes into partnerships, not just to councils. It's routed through the Children's Services Planning Partnerships. Some time was being taken to recruit staff to do particular things and so on. And we should see, with successive evaluations, that demonstration of impact. Neil mentions when you do visit particular projects, particular areas, you get great evidence of delivery locally, but because there is a fair amount of flexibility locally around how the funding is used, there's not a kind of single kind of line around how that's being deployed. So there's complexity in what's being delivered, but we think really good emerging evidence of impact. I think in terms of where did the money, the figure come from, the 500 million. So before my time in terms of engaging with the promise. However, my understanding is that it's based on an estimate of 5% of community health funding as a kind of a benchmark or a frame of reference in terms of the amount of investment that might be needed to support the objectives of the fund.
Okay, thank you. Overall, the progress will be measured in the promised progress framework that Mr Simpson was asking about earlier, and the wider story of progress that needs to be seen in that wider context of whether we're making overall progress.
Okay, but I appreciate time is ticking, so I'm going to try and be very brief in the last two questions. The one isn't very important, that is covered in the report, is the issue of workforce. And if you look at Exhibit 8 to the Auditor General's report, it's a nice visual way of understanding the scale of the problem that we have in Scotland at the moment. Just to pick a few examples, 13% of social workers asked were very likely to leave their job in the next 12 months. I presume that's a fairly high figure. Half of foster carers have considered resigning, and another half experienced burnout and poor well-being. 40% of children, young people, social care staff do not feel safe at work. These are startling statistics and paint a worrying picture of the workforce required to deliver the promise, don't they?
Yeah, we recognise that it's a whole range of different people and workforces, both in the public sector and the third sector, that play a key role in terms of delivering the promise. There are a number of different specific actions that we are taking responding to some of the issues that you were mentioning there. So, for example, you'll be aware that we've committed to establishing the National Social Work Agency, which is currently in shadow form. The new Chief Executive and Chief Social Work Advisor took up post just earlier this week, and will be fully operational from April next year. They will play a crucial role in terms of looking ahead to the future workforce requirements for the social work profession, but also ensuring that we're considering those factors that help the existing social work workforce in terms of responding to the challenges they face, including how we do more to support retention and recruitment into the profession. We have a strand of work that is focused in terms of supporting foster carers. We supported a national campaign earlier this year around recruitment of new foster carers, and also are supporting some work in terms of the immediate support that new foster carers need in terms of taking on that role and responsibility. There's also a lot of work done locally in terms of foster care, and again, walking around Edinburgh, you'll see the adverts for that as well. But we absolutely recognise it is not just purely about the number of staff that are involved in how they are deployed, but also the support that we provide to them, and particularly, for example, around things like trauma support and sharing that trauma training. I don't know if Andrew or Gavin or other colleagues wanted to say any more around that.
You've covered quite a lot, Neil. I suppose just a couple of comments. I know you're a bit short of time. So I think we recognise that another key factor here is the pipeline of future social workers and other members of the workforce. So some investment into graduate apprenticeships for social work could be one example of support in that space. We recognise that some of the issues around cost of living clearly significant as well. So we've looked at the allowances of foster and kinship care. I think there's particular developments around that. And the last point I'd maybe make, because it's a theme across the audit report, is this one of complexity. And I think it's mentioned in Exhibit 8 around the different legislation and so on that social workers and other practitioners have to apply. So there was further guidance issued earlier this year from SSC, which pulls together some of the key building blocks of professional practice to help give that clarity of guidance about how the different pieces of legislation fit together. But it's an area we could possibly look at further going forward.
Thank you. My final question is simply this. We're now 5 years on since the promise was made. There's clearly an ambition and a lot of goodwill in the room amongst stakeholders to meet that promise, but in your professional judgment, are we on track to meet the promise by 2030? And I'm happy to go along the panel.
Are we on track? I mean, I suppose we have to go by what we see in the Oversight Board's reports and what we see in Audit Scotland report. I suppose you've hopefully seen our annual report that was published a couple of months ago. You know, we had some clear asks in there around what we need to succeed. I suppose we're very clear that unless some of those are met, you know, we won't be able to keep the promise. So, are we on track? I think it's a very hard question to answer at this point in time. But I think the next sort of coming months and years will be pivotal in terms of that. I don't think, you know, not all hope is lost. I think we still have the opportunity to do this. And from a local government perspective, we've been clear in our annual report around what we need.
Thank you.
So absolutely just to echo what Fiona said there and to reiterate the point that I made earlier, there is an awful lot of public service reform going to have to go on in the next 5 years. So can we deliver it by 2030? Yes, but we will need to be very deliberate in remembering the promise in all of the public service reform and the efficiency drive that we probably are going to see in the public services as we move forward.
So the short answer is no, at the current pace. Obviously, the Oversight Board reported that we have qualified hope that the promise could still be kept. I will leave this meeting today somewhat frustrated that I haven't been to touch on things like the whole Family Wellbeing Fund, long-term trust-based funding, and to demonstrate again where that pace, who is responsible for that lack of pace, and a specific example around the Children First proposal around family group decision-making. But what I would ask is that Mr Rennick, whose office contacted me twice last week to arrange a meeting, when I seen that the meeting was for only 15 minutes, I declined that we meet and that we discuss, because we're a forward-looking oversight board and we have also solutions to some of these we understand the complexity and we understand about the progress, etc. But we have to focus on where change could happen. And there's some things that could happen now to make that pace, to up that pace. So I look forward to meeting with you if you agree to progress that conversation. And also, if you have any other questions from the Oversight Board, we'd be happy to provide that information.
Thank you. Mr McKinley.
Just to agree with that assessment, I think not on track, not where we'd want to be, but still very much doable. But I think we all recognise the degree of work and the amount of change that needs to happen. My only other point, which is related, if I may, is that one of the really stark findings in the evaluation of children's services plans is that only 8 out of the 30 children's services plans met the criteria around shared resourcing. That, for me, is the key to unlock some of this. We need to better understand what resource, and that's money, people build the whole thing, what we have locally, because actually that, I think, is where the time will be well spent understanding how that investment can happen locally, as well as us doing the national piece. But the fact that in children's services planning partnerships we're still not properly understanding the totality of the public resource in our local communities is a really critical part of the work.
That's helpful feedback. Mr Rennick, will you give Mr Anderson more than 15 minutes of your time? This is an extremely important matter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know that the Minister is due to meet with the Oversight Board, I think, this afternoon, so clearly demonstrating the commitment, but more than happy to meet separately with Mr Anderson to talk through those and other issues. In terms of the question, I think the Oversight Board captured it really well in terms of we remain hopeful and determined, but there is not a moment to waste, and I think that captures it well. I think also young people who spoke to the Education, Children and Young People Committee earlier this year captured it well as well. They said that there are moves in the right direction, but change isn't happening fast enough, but there is still time, and I think we have to take them up on that challenge.
Thank you. If you have anything to add, feel free, but otherwise...
Yeah, I mean, I think so the promise isn't immune to some of the challenges that affect public service delivery across the piece in relation to the current public finance position, the economy, and so on. But I do think that hopefully we've given evidence today, but also in some of the reports, particularly the implementation plan update from last year, there is good progress being made. And I think the key point from me is I do think we have some really strong foundations in which to deliver over the next few years. We've spent some time developing those, but I think we should be confident those will help us reach the target by 2030.
Yeah, just to echo what's been said, I'd like us to be positive. I think that we are making change. Things are changing. When we go and speak to people on the ground who are delivering change, they tell us things are better than they were. We just have to make sure that they're delivering all aspects of the promise over the next few years in order to keep it by 2030.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that draws this part of this morning's agenda to a close. And can I take the opportunity to thank all of you, Fiona Whitelock, Nicola Dickey, David Anderson, Fraser McKinley, Neil Rennick, Andrew Watson, Gavin Henderson. We don't normally, Mr Anderson, have as many as 7 witnesses, so that if we didn't get around to things that you wanted to raise, and this applies to all of you, if there are things that on reflection or contemporaneously you determine it would be useful for the committee to see, then we are very happy to receive any written submissions from you. Once again, thank you very much for your evidence this morning, and I'm now going to suspend the meeting to allow for a changeover of witnesses. Thank you very much. Thank you.
course. Yeah.
Lisa, you just here to heckle from the back.
I'm here to keep an eye on you, Mr. Simpson.
Good luck with that. Somebody should.
No, I'm
I
just
fear you may have arrived too late.
To cover anything as part of the review. I think Rachel's covering progress since. Yeah.
Joe is joining us remotely. If we maybe restart at 11:20 and 30 seconds. I welcome everybody back to the next item on the Public Audit Committee's agenda today, which is consideration of the Auditor General for Scotland's Section 22 report on the 2024-25 audit of NHS Tayside. I'm very pleased to welcome our witnesses this morning. We are joined by the Auditor General, Stephen Boyle. Good morning, Auditor General. And alongside the Auditor General is Rachel Brown, who is an Audit Director at Audit Scotland, and Eva Thomas-Tudor, who is an Audit Manager at Audit Scotland. The committee is also joined by Michael Mara for the evidence session on NHS Tayside. And again, just a reminder that Joe Fitzpatrick is joining us via video link. We've got some questions, Auditor General, but before we get to those, I would like to invite you to make a short opening statement.
Well, many thanks indeed, Convener, and good morning to the committee. Convener, as you mentioned, I'm bringing to you this morning a Section 22 report on the 2024-25 audit of NHS Tayside, which I've prepared under Section 22 of the Public Finance and Accountability Scotland Act 2000. The report brings to the Parliament's attention NHS Tayside's progress in improving mental health services and outlines the substantial issues and challenges that remain for the organisation. Long-standing concerns about mental health services in NHS Tayside resulted in a critical independent inquiry into those services being published in February of 2020. In January of 2023, an independent oversight and assurance group appointed by Scottish ministers published its final report on the progress made by Tayside against the recommendations from the inquiry. It also identified 6 priority areas for NHS Tayside to focus on. NHS Tayside and the 3 Tayside Integration Joint Boards approved the Mental Health and Learning Disabilities Whole System Change Programme in June of 2023 to address these priorities. The Whole System Change Programme has made some progress, such as decreasing the level of mental health delayed discharges and the backlog of repairs needed at Strathmartin Hospital, but substantial issues and challenges remain. The planned move to a single site for inpatient mental health at Murray Royal Hospital in Perth is delayed, and there's a lack of clarity about how concerns relating to the availability of staff and services at the new site will be addressed. Governance and leadership arrangements for the change programme are complicated, unclear and not working well. Progress is not being reported transparently enough to enable good scrutiny and oversight. There remains a lack of clarity about the purpose, role and responsibilities of the groups involved in delivering improvements across NHS Tayside's mental health services. In late 2024, the scope for the change programme was reduced in recognition of a lack of skills and capacity to participate in change. There now needs to be clearly defined priorities for improvement with specific actions, timescales and costs identified. Convener, I'm joined by Rachel Brown, who is the appointed auditor for NHS Tayside. Rachel's annual audit report, from which I've drawn the Section 22 report, covers much of the ground that is referenced in today's report. And I'm also with Rachel, Eva Thomas-Tudo, who was again part of the audit team that supported the preparation of both the annual audit report and today's Section 22 report. As ever, between the three of us, we'll do our best to answer the committee's questions.
Thank you very much indeed. And I have to say that when I read the report, and even just hearing your opening statement there, I could weep, because this does go back, as the report points out, at least back to 2018 and before that. And I think of Mandy McLaren, who lost her son Dale. I think of Gillian Murray, who lost her uncle to suicide at around the Carsview site. I mean, these were very traumatic and moving human stories, which drove the government to establish the Strang Review, which led to reports, although we did reach a point, I think, where there were complaints about reviews on reviews, but without progress being seen. So when I read the litany of conclusions you draw, the single site provision and what a mess that appears to be, complicated structures, stakeholder engagement being unclear. I mean, these are all familiar themes that we've been around the circuit on so many times. Meanwhile, people have been failed. I mean, it really does feel as though no progress has been made in the course of 7 or 8 years.
So the frustration is very real and reasonable, Convener. Actually, you're right. This is not a new issue, as I referenced in my opening remarks. And yet, some of the themes have lingered, both from the independent reviews by David Strang, the follow-up review by the Independent Oversight and Assurance Group. And as I set out in my opening statement, some of the context, while there is some progress, important progress, in some of the areas around delayed discharges and some of the estate, is clearly not enough. So, so I think carefully about preparing statutory reports on any public body. But today's report sets out some of the important issues that remain outstanding to be addressed. I think it can be maybe helpful for the committee to hear from Rachel, actually, because I think what we've seen, because as you know, we make recommendations or findings in audit reports. The annual audit report has, it's not quite a lift and shift from that into the Section 22 report, but there's a clear read across. But the annual audit report also includes the response of management from NHS Tayside to the recommendations. And I think they are a robust set of responses. But as always, as auditors, we have professional scepticism about, a robust response is welcome, but it's the action that accompanies those commitments that really matters. And that's something that we will be looking to do by way of follow-up, both during next year's annual audit, and I'll certainly give consideration to further public reporting on such an important matter that affects, as you mentioned, Convener, not in an abstract sense, the really very direct implications it has for patients and their families. If you're happy, I may be keen to bring Rachel in just to say a bit more about that.
Thanks, Mr Boyle. So, in my annual audit report, the findings that you'll have hopefully before you, the Health Board have taken on board the findings. They fully accepted the findings, and the response to the draft audit report when we were checking with factual accuracy and agreement with senior officers was immediate, and the whole executive team was involved in that consideration and agreement of the management actions in the annual audit report appendix with the action plan. And since then, to clarify, I have not performed a follow-up audit in the period since that has happened. I will follow up on those recommendations in my 2025-26 audit, which is just in its very initial planning stages. But I see progress being reported to the Board and to the Audit and Risk Committee, and indeed to other relevant committees in the Health Board. So that refocus of the whole system change programme into two models of care in its initial stages, the general adult model of care, general adult mental health model of care, and then the learning disability model of care. The focus is very much on progressing those. and that's the general adult mental health model of care is out for consultation just now, and the other model of care is in development. There was an immediate call to action and a cross-board statement of intent from the Health Board as to how to move forward, so step up that pace. We recognise in the report the complexity of whole system change, and the findings in my report reflect that complexity of change. So there's a realism in the refocus of that very complex work. The Health Board's also looking to get in place a single executive lead. We mention limited capacity and skills to lead change. That's one way of bringing in both additional capacity and having that unity of oversight for all mental health services. There's currently, I think, 5 directors of the different aspects of mental health services in the NHS Tayside. So they're looking to bring in a single executive lead. And I understand discussions with the Scottish Government are quite supportive of that, but it does require lifting of a ministerial direction from 2020 when Trust and Respect came out. That gave clarity at that point on responsibility for inpatient services sitting with NHS Tayside and responsibility for community mental health services sitting with Tayside IGBs led by Perth and Kinross IGB. So the IGBs and the NHS Tayside are working together to drive that forward.
And am I right in thinking that NHS Tayside is still at level 3 in the escalation process?
You're correct in that, Convener. Perhaps it's helpful just to set out some of the history in the context of the Scottish Government's engagement with Tayside. In respect of mental health services, Tayside was escalated first to level 5 in April of 2018. It then reduced to level 4 in February 19, and in June of 2021, following the Strang reviews and the independent oversight group, it was 2 different escalation levels, which have remained constant for the 4.5 years since then. Level 2 for finance, governance and leadership, and level 3 for mental health services.
Yeah. I'm going to invite Joe Fitzpatrick in a second, but I've just got one last question before I do that, which is one of the features of the earlier phases of the reviews and the response from the Health Board was, I think, what David Strang described as over-reporting of progress and an optimism bias. Rachel Brown, you talked about realism and so on. I mean, what's your sense of whether the board is being given an optimistic picture of what's changing on the ground? What's your sense of whether the board's been presented with cold, hard facts about where things have reached? I mean, the Section 22 report, as I mentioned at the very beginning, has a whole series of areas where things are not going as they ought to do.
I'll maybe offer a thought or two and bring Rachel in again. So I think there's something of a mixed picture, Convener. I would say in this, that on the one hand, as I mentioned in my opening statement, they've reduced the scope of some of the work. And actually, reducing the scope, you can look at it 2 ways. One is like, okay, you need that's a reduction in the service or the planned activity, but it's perhaps also a realistic response, to what resources were available. Okay, you can look at it in perhaps in both those respects. Then other aspects of monitoring and review not being in place. So there's an absence of or a lack of KPIs in terms of progress feels really important. And then we talk also about governance and leadership not being as clear around mental health services as it needs to be. And these are all the relevant components of how the system and progress would be monitored and reported to the board. So I don't think you can take comfort that there has been the kind of progress that ought to have been warranted in the intervening period from the completion of the independent oversight group and prior to it from Strang's report before that. But again, Rachel will have a closer assessment of that.
Thank you. In terms of reporting to the board, I would say the reaction to my annual audit report drove the reaction across the whole executive team in terms of responding to that, and also action across the whole board. I'm aware, I'm also the appointed auditor for 2 of the Tayside integration joint boards, that progress reporting has been made to all the IGBs and to the NHS Tayside board. But there was, in the month, possibly 2 months after the annual audit report was produced, a whole board workshop on the issues, how it got to where it's got to in terms of mental health services and what the next steps are. And every single board member was involved in that, either at the workshop or in one-to-ones with the Chief Exec where they couldn't attend on the day. So there's that sight on where reporting, progress reporting has got to, and the gaps that we have reported in both my annual audit report and the Section 22 report. So they're cited on it, and some of the responses to the annual audit report are driven from that need for effective performance monitoring, KPIs and reporting in clear governance lines.
Yeah. Auditor General.
I think it's maybe just worth highlighting for the record. I think as the Section 22 report sets out, firstly paragraph 14 and then paragraph 16, some of the governance deficiencies really that are around the system. So some of the structures, as we say, 13, not working well. The executive leadership group that was in place and then disbanded and then still being referred to in leadership group in board discussions. Then at paragraph 16, citing what seems to be pretty poor examples of governance, of a lack of minutes being taken of meetings, fundamentals similarly of papers not being provided to support good scrutiny, verbal updates being a feature. These are simple but important things. Just not having that level of rigour in place serves to undermine good scrutiny, effective governance, but probably more important, I think, where you got to, Convener, actually just the confidence that it can give patients, families, of how this system is operating. I think maybe going back not to management response in detail, but we hope this is there is a sustained response to some of the recommendations that we make in today's reports.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to now invite Joe Fitzpatrick to put some questions to you. Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Convener. As a constituency MSP for Dundee City West, which is within the Tayside NHS area, I am acutely aware of long-standing, widespread concerns held regarding the provision of mental health services across Tayside. So like colleagues, I'm regularly contacted by constituents who've encountered difficulties accessing support. I'm often contacted by families and friends of constituents who've not received anywhere near the level of support they should have. And I'm in contact with NHS Tayside on behalf of constituents every single day. Mental health provision, or the lack of, is more often than not the reason that my intervention is required. David Strang, as we heard, was appointed chair of the independent inquiry into mental health services in Tayside in July 2018. His final report was published in February 2020, and the Independent Oversight and Assurance Group published its final report in 2023. And yet here we are now at the end of 2025, and I know that my constituents in Dundee will be asking what progress has been made. I'm extremely concerned NHS Tayside simply does not have the required expertise to make the substantial improvements required, as highlighted in this report, to improve patient care and to subsequently improve confidence of members of this committee, the wider Parliament, and most importantly, those living in the NHS Tayside area. So I'd be grateful for the Auditor General's view on whether or not we have now reached a point where external oversight is required.
I think there's maybe two things I would point to, but I don't think I'll be able to give you yet the assurance that you'll be looking for your constituent responsibilities or this committee more widely. I'll turn to Rachel in a moment, actually, just to say some of the, perhaps both the governance and leadership changes that have been made. And whilst that's important, they are new changes. They're perhaps in response to this report, but perhaps might have been coming anyway. The management response, as we touched on, feels robust. But again, with professional scepticism, I think as you've set out in your question, Mr Fitzpatrick, we're not in new territory in terms of there being concerns about mental health services in Tayside. what matters clearly is that there's sustained follow-through that builds confidence of elected members, the Parliament and patients and their families. So from an audit perspective, we'll make recommendations as we have, and Rachel has in her report, and we will follow through and report publicly the progress upon those. It will be for others to determine how leadership structures and how those are supported, along with the Scottish Government's quite well-established arrangements for support and intervention, and whether that's doing what's necessary to support the changes that are required to mental health services in Tayside. Rachel can maybe say a bit more about some of the recent developments in terms of executive leadership, together with some of the governance changes that have been brought into.
Thank you. Yes, so in recent months, the Chief Exec has created an enhanced monitoring and scrutiny executive, which is that executive team oversight on a fortnightly basis to review progress of the mental health services programme and the development of both the medium-term delivery plan and the models of care. So there's that executive level oversight happening very regularly. The Health Board has also been in contact with the Scottish Government around the potential to bring in a single executive lead for mental health services. So they are hopeful that that may come in the near future, which would give that capacity and leadership for change. The Health Board has also expanded the Programme Management Office, which exists to support those who are driving that change activity and to provide extra capacity. So I will be following up on the effectiveness of the responses to my audit report and Section 22 report as part of the 25-26 audit, but those are the immediate arrangements, key governance arrangements that are in place. They're also, the Health Board is also looking to demonstrate or set out in a simple, understandable way the governance arrangements for that change activity, because we recognise in the report that the lines of governance and accountability are complicated and unclear. Thank you.
That's really helpful. I think I guess one of the points I would have is that there is a lack of confidence, and it's going to take a long time for that to be restored. One of the things that I think would help would be if there was more transparency. So you talked about these regular meetings. Is that going to be put into a transparent form where my constituents and constituents of other MSPs in the room will be able to access that, so they can see that change is actually happening and the oversight required is actually happening?
So at this stage, I don't know what the Health Board's plans are. I think that's a question for the Health Board to answer.
Okay, thanks. I guess that the challenge is we've kind of heard so many positive managerial words over the years that I think more transparency would be really helpful. But I'll leave that there just now, and you may be right, that might be a question that I can put directly to NHS Tayside. So you also stated in the report that the Mental Health and Learning Disabilities whole system change programme has made some progress in addressing the issues identified by the subsequent independent oversight and assurance group, but that substantial issues and challenges remain. I wonder if you could advise the committee of where progress has been made and where issues and challenge remains.
Yeah, we can do. I think I'll turn to Eva in a second, actually, just to set in a bit more detail. But we set out Exhibit 1, the first item in the Section 22 report, some of the progress. So, for example, mental health delayed discharges have decreased, and together with some of the progress around consideration of the estate. As you mentioned, there's quite a tail to the provision of or reviews of mental health services, together with Strang reviews and then the independent oversight and assurance group consideration. So we look to set it, but I think particularly the kind of remaining fundamental issue to be addressed is in terms of the single site provision. So that Murray Royal Hospital was identified as the decision to move to a single site back in 2018 And 7 years later, it doesn't seem to be we are clear enough yet as to if and when that move will be made. Significant concerns about, from staff and others about the suitability of the site, how staff are being engaged with. There are clearly matters to be overcome. And whilst I mentioned that some of the positive developments in delayed discharges for mental health delayed discharges, we're not seeing the same level of progress around learning disability delayed discharges either. So again, while there are some positives, there are some significant, perhaps fundamental issues still to be addressed. But again, if you're content, Mr Fitzpatrick, I'll maybe turn to Eva just to set that out in a bit more detail.
Yeah, happy to touch on that latter point a little bit more detail. So the kind of higher levels of learning disability delayed discharge has been quite a long-standing problem, and plans in place to address those have not progressed. The Tayside plan to recruit a complex care discharge lead, and that planned recruitment was delayed, and there was a lack of suitable community provision for patients with very complex needs in Tayside, and those issues have not been resolved yet either. Tayside has been working with the Health and Social Care Partnerships to explore options such as developing shared accommodation across all the 3 HSCP areas, but there's not yet a clear plan in place to address those delays.
And any suggestion of when that plan would be put in place?
We didn't get that answer. I don't know if Rachel has any further updates since our review was carried out, but we didn't get a clear response on that.
So in terms of the move to Murray Royal, there's a phased approach, but the dates for that are still to be determined because there's one-to-one discussions with the staff about whether they transfer. So that's very much in progress, so I can't give you a date for that.
Okay, that's obviously a really important part of any such process, so thanks for that. In the report, you've said that you expect to see NHS Tayside implementing the actions recommended within the timescale that it has committed to, and that you'll continue to monitor progress with the issues, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, Auditor General, highlighted in the report, and consider further reporting as necessary. I know that the First Minister is also actively monitoring this and has given a commitment to undertaking a review next month. So can you advise the committee what NHS Tayside has committed to and the options available to you in terms of further monitoring and further reporting going forward?
Yeah, happy to do that. And I was and followed the exchange, I think, between Mr Mara and the First Minister, First Minister's questions, where the First Minister made those remarks. As it relates to the information that we have from NHS Tayside in respect of their response to the audit recommendations, some of these timescales, to an extent, have already passed. Some were October. Somewhere in terms of KPIs would to be delivered again by the 1st of this month. So of the key recommendations, there are management responses both to accept and to set out what will be done. Whether that, I think, allows definitive assurance, I think would take a little bit longer than the date of which the recommendation would be implemented. And again, only because of, I think, what has gone before Mr Fitzpatrick, and it's not to question or challenge the appropriateness of the management response, but rather just to see that change is embedded, and that feels the fundamental next step. So, as Rachel mentions, we'll absolutely follow these up and report publicly through the annual audit, and I likewise will give proper consideration to further reporting to Parliament on the progress that NHS Tayside is making during 2026.
But thanks very much for that, and I think that will definitely be appreciated by my constituents. Thank you. Thanks, getting on.
Okay, Joe, thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to turn to Graham Simpson to put some questions to you. Graham.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Auditor General, the report focuses on mental health quite rightly, but there is a section on it which deals with the general financial situation in NHS Tayside, and of course we've discussed that in relation to other boards. And other boards have had to have brokerage from the Scottish Government. Another way of putting that would be they've been bailed out, but Luckily, NHS Tayside didn't need any of that in 24-25 in order to break even. However, they did rely on non-recurring savings, and there were some late allocations. So for me, that poses a bit of a risk. Is that something you'd agree with?
So I think what we've said actually in both the Tayside report, and then you'll recall from evidence that we gave to the committee on the other two NHS Section 22 reports in the past couple of weeks on Ayrshire and Arran and Grampian, is the need for clearer transparency around how either whether brokerage or late funding allocations is made by the Scottish Government to NHS boards that are anticipating that they'll not be able to break even. So Tayside is different this year. It was one of the boards that, as I think my colleagues confirmed to you in evidence, that previously received brokerage. Yeah. It didn't need brokerage during 2024-25. But as we mentioned in paragraph 6, to deliver its financial targets, it received late funding allocations and relied upon non-recurring savings. So it's perhaps, and I'll bring Rachel in actually, she'll have looked at this closely during the audit process, it's perhaps indicative of there are still significant financial challenges that NHS Tayside is experiencing in order to deliver upon its service objectives and meet its financial targets. The committee will be aware that we published our annual report on the NHS in Scotland earlier this month, and of the opportunity to give evidence to you on that report early in the new year. And that report sets out in detail, I think, what we're setting out the need for more transparency about how NHS boards are receiving financial support from the Scottish Government, whether it's brokerage, progress against savings, or late funding allocations, and what that then means for their financial position and their ability to deliver for their populations and meet the targets set for them by the Scottish Government. But just for completeness, no, they didn't need brokerage this year, but through a combination of other measures, they delivered financial balance. I'll maybe bring Rachel and just say kind of how that manifested.
Thank you. Yes, in terms of NHS Tayside's financial management in general, I have concluded that their financial management arrangements are effective, but they do rely on non-recurring savings and late allocations. And NHS Tayside delivered cash releasing savings of £36.1 million last year, but that was still a shortfall against its target. And I note that only 18.9 million of those savings are recurring. So my recommendation to the Health Board is to focus on improving the delivery of targeted recurring savings plans. And I note that in the current financial year, the Health Board is noting a shortfall against its savings plans this year. So there's strong financial management in the board, but I also note that service delivery models are not financially sustainable. The significant financial sustainability risk continues for the Health Board, and they need to redesign services to ensure financially sustainable services going forward. So that's, again, something that's not unique to Tayside, but that's the position is they are delivering savings. They have a shortfall against their target, and there are financial recovery plans in place for the current year, and reporting indicates that that's having an impact. I think the Sustainability and Recovery Group, I will just check I've got the name right, has delivered just under £28 million in the current year, which is still short of target, and the Health Board is projecting an £11.4 million deficit for 25-26. So those are continuing issues that are being faced and managed by the Health Board. So that issue and the risk around sustainability of services continues.
So just to be clear, so this year it looks like they're going to be £11.4 million short.
Yes, that's the latest reported position to board.
And that will impact on the services they can deliver.
The Health Board will be managing what savings and financial recovery actions it can to shrink that gap, and they will be in discussion with the Scottish Government about any support that may be available for that. So in last year, that manifested itself in the £12.5 million allocation at the end of the year to address acute system pressures.
Except the Scottish Government has made it clear, I'm not quite sure how they'll achieve this, given the state of play in a number of boards, but they've made it clear they're not going to entertain any more brokerage. So if NHS Tayside has a shortfall of 11.4 million, I'm not asking you to come up with a solution for the government, but you can see the problem, can't you?
I think, and again, I'm sure we'll cover this when we speak to you in the new year on the NHS overview report, but you're right. So we think there needs to be clearer and more transparency about, well, if there's not going to be any more brokerage, what then happens, whether it's to NHS Tayside or any other board that isn't able to deliver within the financial resources allocated to it. We think there's more clarity really required upon that. So I think, so on the one hand, you might think it's welcome that NHS Tayside didn't need brokerage during 2024-25, but to receive a late funding allocation, is another form of, recognition of either financial pressures or support or to meet service requirements within the board. Setting this out clearly about how different scenarios will be managed by the Scottish Government feels like, again, an important next step.
Yeah. I mean, of course I welcome it. I welcome the fact they didn't need brokerage, but that I think masks bigger problems. The fact they can't, they've had to rely on non-recurring savings. 18.9 million in the year that you've looked at of the 36.1 million savings were recurring, so the rest were non-recurring. I mean, it's quite a significant figure, isn't it?
It is. It is a significant figure, and it's been a consistent feature of how health boards have delivered their financial position to use typically a combination of recurring and non-recurring savings, brokerage or funding allocations to get them over the line. But I just agree with the point Rachel makes. It's not a sustainable model to continue to look for non-recurring savings, and you can see the strain that with 7 health boards in 24-25 requiring brokerage to get them over the line. That sense of their ability to keep delivering non-recurring savings is evidence that through the brokerage that government is having to provide to get them into a balanced financial position.
Yeah. Thanks, Convener. I'll leave it there.
OK, thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to turn to Colin Beattie to put some questions to you. Colin.
Thank you, Convener. In the report, and you've touched on it yourself, mental health delayed discharges generally decreased, but delayed discharges in learning disability services were high. Was there a reason why that is particularly high compared to regular mental health delayed discharge? I'm not sure whether you would say regular mental health discharges, but you understand what I'm getting at there. Why the differentiation, and why is that a specific issue?
Yeah, I'll bring you in actually just to kind of set out why there's a difference between the two types of service requirements, and again a bit more detail why the challenge is particularly associated with learning disability. Thanks.
Yeah, happy to. So for the learning disabilities patients that are experiencing delayed discharges, the very long delayed discharges, some over a year, and the reason that the board has been struggling to discharge the patients into community settings is largely because of a lack of community provision in Tayside, and so it's been working with the health and social care partnerships in the area to identify suitable community provision, but it has not yet been able to find a solution to suitable accommodation for patients.
So what's the target for delayed discharges versus the actuality?
I don't have that detail.
Okay.
We can come back to the committee in writing, actually, just with the latest position that's reported in terms of target versus actual performance. But I think, as Eva said, some of these cases will be really complex. The availability of suitable accommodation, support packages outside of hospital. I mean, Rachel might want to say a bit more. She mentioned her role in terms of the IJB, but if it's not something we have to hand, certainly we can either signpost the committee or come back to you in writing.
Presumably, and even may be able to comment on this, it's not actually a systemic problem. It's simple supply out, in the community. That's the problem.
So I think, again, I'll bring colleagues in a second, actually, but I think it'll be a combination of both of those things. From Audit Scotland's work programme, we will soon be publishing a wider report on delayed discharges early in 2026, about how the system in totality is working for that throughput through hospitals. Again, I appreciate the committee is very familiar with some of the wider pressures in the NHS and the central role that getting people into an appropriate setting as quickly as and as safely as possible is a key part of how the system either is or isn't operating in different parts of the country. But again, I'll pause if colleagues want to come back on some of the specifics.
But perhaps if your colleagues are commenting, they could also maybe comment on the lack of a plan to reduce these delays and what more could be done, should be done in this regard.
So I'll comment very briefly. I don't have the target versus actual or actual versus target at this point. In terms of availability of community provision, that is the key reason. In some cases, I understand there's no provision in Scotland that is suitable, so it's a case of constructing provision in the community, which I believe responsibility sits with the integration joint boards for commissioning those community models. And in terms of the planning for that, I don't have that information to hand. I know there are some active discharge plans for patients who are waiting for a newly commissioned model to be available, and the intention is that they would be discharged hopefully in the first half of 2026. But in terms of the detail, I would need to get further information, or you need to seek that from the Health Board.
You're talking about community-based solutions here. Would that entail the construction of some sort of a specialised centre for people with these sort of disabilities to be moved into for their support? Or do they go out into the community as individuals scattered around? I'm just trying to get my head around how they're approaching this.
So I don't know the detail of the plans. My understanding is there are discussions between the three Tayside integration joint boards, the health and social care partnerships, about the possibility of shared accommodation, and for some individual patients it would be an individual placement for them, and it was very much it depends on the individual needs.
I think I would add, Mr. Beattie, is that there is, whilst absolutely recognising it has to be appropriate for the individual patient, and their families, about where they would be appropriately discharged from hospital into a homely or a more homely setting than a hospital can provide if that's no longer clinically required. But I think what we set out at Exhibit 1 is that some of these cases are long-standing in terms of delayed discharges, but the NHS Tayside and the three IJBs don't yet have a clear plan in place to reduce the delays. That feels really fundamental and really important that that's that progress that's made. And yes, if that requires to either acquire or build appropriate accommodation, that's factored into plans. The extent of the delay is the issue that has to be tackled.
But they are actively working on this, coming up with a plan?
So I think what we'd say in the report was not yet seen a clear plan to reduce the delays. That's the issue that NHS Tayside, together with the three IJBs, will be better placed to explain where they go next.
Mm. Okay. I'm just moving on a little bit to look at the change programme, Living Life Well. or at least in support of living life well. You comment that there's a lack of capacity for staff to lead and participate in change. And you also say that the new models of care, work streams and priorities have not been agreed, and there's not yet a clear delivery plan in place with specific actions, timescales and costs. You also say the change programme is overly complex. I'd like to understand a little bit more about that complexity. And it lacks a clear delivery plan. I'd be interested in hearing more about the delivery plan that they're thinking of. And also, finally, what in your view needs to be done urgently to make this programme deliverable?
So I'll maybe start with your last question, and Eva and Rachel can talk the committee through some of the judgments we've made about the Living Well and the whole system change plan. What needs to be done is a clear, realistic plan. You know, it's as simple as that. You know, one that's appropriately resourced with staff engagement appropriately with patients and their families, clarity around how that will be measured, monitored, appropriate KPIs, the right governance to support oversight, and clear leadership. And I think there's what I don't want to risk doing is saying, well, that's all very straightforward and simple. If it was that easy, it would have been done by now. But I think the issue is it's taking too long. It's taking too long to address the issues that are set out, certainly not for the first time in this report, but that the system can come together between NHS Tayside, the local authorities, the IJBs, to find appropriate solutions faster than is already being done for patients in the area. I'll bring Eva in first of all, and then Rachel, just to kind of respond to the other points that you've made.
Before they come in, can I just ask you one question based on what you've said? Obviously, things are not moving as fast as they should have. Is there a willingness between the different stakeholders to work positively together towards a solution?
So again, I think that's a question for the leaders of the organisations themselves to best evidence. We'll have seen, and Rachel have seen this through her audit work, that there is a commitment. So we've seen a renewed commitment in the management responses to our audit recommendations. But we've had commitments before, and that's why I don't wish to give you false or additional assurance. I think the assurance that you will get is from action in tackling the challenges that are set out, and not just in today's report. So that's what matters most next. Eva.
Thanks. Just helpful maybe to provide a bit of context. So the whole system change programme that was introduced in 2023 was introduced on the back of the IOAG's finding that the Living Life Well change programme was overly complex. And so the whole system change programme was put in place to streamline that and try and make it more achievable. But part of our review found that there was still a lack of capacity for staff to participate in change and take forward the change that was needed. And so late last year, the board decided to reduce the scope of the whole system change programme again, in recognition of kind of the need to streamline that further. And it's taking forward these models of care as its next kind of iteration of the change programme. And so Rachel's report, the external auditor's report this year, recommended that now refreshed priorities for improvement are needed as part of the new models of care, with a clear implementation plan, with clear timescales, costs, and also how the work will be resourced to make sure that it's actually deliverable.
I suppose the word I keep coming back to is complex. You're talking about streamlining and so on. Have they actually recognised that it's that the change programme is overly complex?
I would say so. There's been a response in terms of some of the programme and the governance and oversight arrangements. So the whole system change programme has evolved recently into the adult mental health and learning disability models of care programmes. So I think, again, the risk of repeating myself, Mr Beattie, to say that this might be an evolution into a different or seem to be less complex oversight and governance arrangements. Some of the planned changes to executive leadership that Rachel mentions, might well be an appropriate next step, as well as giving more focus or authority within an individual director to drive through some of the changes that are necessary. But I think we're in a bit of a wait and see position at the moment, that any changes that come through are effective. That will be the key test.
Just moving on a little bit down that road, the review also said it wasn't clear that stakeholder engagement was carried out or what indicators were used to make the assessment that the system was working well. Given that there's a mismatch between the WSCP board's assessment and NHS Tayside's own view of the progress on integration, how confident are you that governance and leadership arrangements are supporting genuine integration across the system?
Yeah, Eva can take this one. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Just to I guess expand on that point. So this was part of a review that the Whole System Change Programme Board did late last year in a review of its own work streams as part of a request from the Scottish Government for an update, and it assessed that indicators suggested that the integration was working well, and that stakeholder feedback showed that things were working well across the system. But when we asked for evidence of that, to kind of what informed that assessment, we were not provided with any detail about how that assessment was made. So that led to our conclusion in that report.
And just continuing, maybe my last question actually, was really about engaging the workforce. Apparently there's not been much in the way of engagement with the workforce workstream. A review of progress in October 24 acknowledged that this was not meeting as a formal work stream, but reported that staff engagement was underway across the change programme, but there was a lacking a systematic approach to staff engagement. So what do they have to do what improvements do they have to do to make this meaningful and make sure that staff engagement is incorporated into this going forward?
Yeah, I think you've said much of what we set out in the report, Mr Beattie, but maybe just for completeness, that a work stream was introduced on staff engagement, and a review in October 24 acknowledged that progress was not meeting, as process acknowledged it wasn't meeting as a formal work stream, but they reported that staff engagement was underway across the change programme. However, it lacked a systemic approach, the review, to staff engagement, and has introduced what's now referred to as collaborative conversations, which involves meeting with staff members every 3 months. We conclude, though, that it was not clear how this is going to feature into decision-making. As we've touched on a couple of times, of course the views of staff matter. That they have to be persuaded, supported, given the right conditions and environment with which to deliver services for their patients. And as mentioned by Mr Fitzpatrick, that the move to Murray Royal Hospital clearly remains the biggest sticking point, and however that is overcome or addressed as a matter for NHS Tayside to find a way through that it can appropriately engage with its workforce in order to deliver the services that they are there to provide.
It certainly seems to be a huge deficiency if they can't take the workforce with them. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Colin. I'm now going to invite Michael Mara to put some questions to you. Michael.
Thanks, Convener. Can thank you and the committee for being and allowing me time today, and also to the Auditor General for, I think, a very, I hope, useful report, but you've rightly highlighted that there have been an awful lot of reports before from various sources. Can I start with delayed discharge and following on from what Colin Beattie was talking about? You've said that it's taking too long and there is no clear plan. Ryan Caswell, a constituent of mine, has been a delayed discharge patient for 5 years and 10 months in completely inappropriate settings. I've raised this case again and again and again and again. And there seems to be no progress in terms of not just getting him out of the inappropriate setting and into a situation. So is the structure limiting the progress? You've touched a little bit about the interaction between the Health Board and the IJBs. In the research that you've done and the work you've looked at, is it the fact that this is just actually intractable, the relationship between the IJBs and the Health Board, to deliver an outcome and make the change?
So, first thing I say, I'm not familiar with your constituent's case, but as an example of a delayed discharge, clearly that is a matter that needs to be addressed. Part of the whole system that is there to provide people with the appropriate setting with which to receive either hospital care or support outside in a homely setting. I don't think we can reach a conclusion that says that the system isn't working well, because there are systems and partnerships across Scotland that are able to deliver services appropriately, that won't be experiencing, and again, forgive me, I don't know the complexity of the case that you're referring to, and I'm sure that's not an indication of unwillingness, but it seems to be that there clearly needs to be factors addressed. And I think we touched on other parts of the report about leadership, governance, oversight arrangements, monitoring progress, that is not working well enough to address the very real presenting issues of your constituents. I think there have been changes, but these are very new changes in terms of whether it's executive leadership, governance and oversight. All of these have to come together effectively to work and tackle the very real issues that are set out in the report that you mentioned.
Okay. On this issue then about leadership, you started the session by talking about this, Auditor General, and the quote about the NHS Tayside has limited skills and capacity for leading and participating in whole system change. It really jumps out. You've identified that they are trying to bring in a single member of staff to do that. Could you talk more about where that capacity and capability is missing? So is it in the IJBs? Is it in the central leadership? What is the deficit they're trying to make up?
Yeah, happy to. I'll maybe bring Rachel in, actually, who's kind of looked at this from an audit perspective. And I think there may be limitations in what we can kind of offer in terms of a view, because some of these are planned or new changes. Perhaps before turning to Rachel, maybe just kind of draw on some of the wider conclusions from her audit work, that we are not identifying deficiencies per se in the wider leadership or governance of NHS Tayside, but very clearly in terms of its mental health services. And I think that is where the intended action in terms of mental health executive leadership is now planned. Together with, there's been recent changes to some of the executive leadership of the board as well. Some of that will take time to embed, and that's really what has to happen now. That the impact of the change, the plan, is felt by the patients of NHS at Tayside. But again, I'll turn to Rachel maybe to set more of that detail out.
Okay. To give some brief information around that, there have been changes at executive level in NHS Tayside, including a new chief exec.
Almost every year. And
yes, I note there was an interim chief exec last year, and now there's a permanently appointed chief executive in NHS Tayside. There's a new chair of the board of NHS Tayside who comes in with Healthcare Improvement Scotland experience. And the chief executive is bringing in, or has brought in, new corporate objectives to bring renewed focus to driving change in NHS Tayside and delivering for the people of Tayside. The leadership of the change programme, which is now refocused as the adult model of care and learning disability model of care programme. These are very senior people who are leading that change programme. That's part of their job. That's not their sole job. So there's capacity stretch there as well, and in freeing up. I think Eva's found at other levels in terms of that. People need the capacity. The Programme Management Office has been brought in or has been created to provide that support for the change programme and to free up some of that leadership capacity. But as we say in our report, there's just stretched them. There's limited capacity to make things happen, to drive that.
Okay, thank you. Was it the new chief executive or one of the previous two in the last 3 years that downgraded the scope of the programme? When did the downgrading happen?
So it was November 2024 was when the scope was most recently reduced, and I'm going to say the chief executive joined in August 2024, but I would have to search for the right page in my report.
So one of the responses of the new leadership team, you're saying bring in this different expertise, was to downgrade the scope of this programme. That was part of their response to the crisis, to say actually we need to narrow the focus.
I think as I mentioned to the convener, it's perhaps two aspects of that. One is you can say you downgrade the scope, and that's that fails to address, but it's perhaps a focus, and it'll be for the executive to speak for themselves, as to kind of why that decision was made, but their ability to focus and deliver against multiple priorities all at the same time. So, but I think we would recognise that having a clear plan that is deliverable matters most. I think maybe going back to your earlier example for a second, I'm sure there will have been multiple commitments made to address over the years your constituents' requirements, but not then delivered upon to them or their family's satisfaction. Being realistic about what's deliverable and focused matters alongside having just committing to a plan regardless of scope.
Okay, sticking with scope for a moment, will the current scope of the whole systems change programme meet the 51 recommendations of Strang?
So I think time will tell.
Does it intend to, though?
So some of the recommendations of Strang will have already been met. There's the outstanding ones, and again, to an extent, then rolled up into the review of the independent oversight group as well. So it'll be for NHS Tayside to set out really clearly how time has evolved. Some of those will have been met, some will be superseded. We've seen change of the whole system. Change programme is now morphed into the models of care. That's part of the complexity we've got here, actually, is that we've been able to track and monitor progress, that the system of today can still evidence effectiveness and support.
So is anybody reporting to the board on the progress against those 51 recommendations? Are we seeing that as that was the report that was set out? There was a lot of work went into analysis. Are those reported on? Because I can't see evidence that they actually are. They're being substituted by one programme after another, rather than saying, this is the mission, we need to deliver it, how do we get there? Because we're 6 years on.
Well, indeed. And I think that's for NHS Tayside to satisfy itself. So we've got a new board chair, a new chief executive. Some of the long-standing issues that that we've revisited in this report is that so recommendations of 6 years ago may or may not still be necessary to address, but there's clearly issues that have to be tackled, and in a governance that's complex, changing leadership, I think there's an issue about scrutiny and transparency that the board can also need to satisfy.
But surely there has to be consistency in that. If Rachel Brown, in the work that you're doing examining it, are you seeing evidence that the board are asking and seeing reports against those 51 recommendations, or are they reporting against a whole system change programme that may represent some of them and not others, and things of different scope? Have we lost focus on the outcome of that report over the 6 years?
So if I could just come in, on reporting to the board that we reviewed as part of the audit work is on the whole system change programme, and as Eva was finding, we looked at the changed focus over time of that programme. So the reporting is on the current programme as it is.
And not the Strang recommendations?
What we can do, Mr. Maher, is maybe actually just go back and check from our records of board minutes.
Yeah, they're not reporting against the 51 recommendations.
They're not. Okay. I mean, that in a changing environment of different leadership over different time, surely losing sight of those recommendations, because this was 2020, the progress report came back in 2021. That was being described to me as the worst report in Scottish public life, because as the convener pointed out, it represented local bodies in Dundee misleading the public about progress that hadn't been made. We had the Oversight Assurance Group in 2021 that reported in 2023. Then we've had the whole system change programme. I mean, all of this brings me to the point of, do we not need external leadership brought in to actually deliver this? Because the current model of leadership just isn't working, is it?
So, I guess, mentioned to Mr Fitzpatrick, ultimately that will be a decision for ministers, together with any advice they take from the Chief Executive of the NHS in Scotland. What we do, though, is, as you know, we will make recommendations, we will follow up that, and we will report publicly on progress through our audit work. Today's report sets out that there are significant challenges to be addressed.
Okay. On single site provision, another example of this, Mental Welfare Commission have reported on the state of Strathmartin in 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2023 and 2024. The 2024 report reported what I described as Dickensian conditions in Strathmartin, and that report was only published half an hour before I had a meeting with the Chair and the Chief Executive of the Mental Welfare Commission, and it was months late. They wouldn't have published it unless I'd asked for a meeting with them. You talk about oversight and accountability. You know, these are the reports that the leadership should have been responding to and weren't. Now, you've said that there have been changes made to the physical environment. I agree with that. I've been to the site. I've seen those changes that have been made. But what really concerns me in this is that you've said that there's no clear plan and no costings for a move to a single site provision. Do you think that has to be provided and put into the public domain for that sake of accountability by the board?
So I think there has to be transparency, absolutely, but what the intention is. And then, rather than to have just an intention about a clear deliverable plan, absolutely matters, so that for all the reasons that you touch on, that patients, their families, the public can have assurance and confidence that the plan that the board has agreed to can be delivered upon.
So I asked on the 2nd of May of the board, when will the board next examine the case and costings for the move? And they have still provided no indication as to when the board would examine the business case and the costings associated with that. Have you, Rachel Brown, seen in your work, or Eva Thomas-Turo, have you seen any evidence that they have looked at a revised plan with the costings and the impact for this move?
Before bringing colleagues in, I want to maybe just again highlight to the committee, at the time of our review, it was not clear if the move was on track, as timescales and expected costs were not available. We found a disconnect between the leadership and staff's views about the move, and the risk register highlighted that there were significant risks to be addressed. Okay. If that's context for the record, I'll bring colleagues in. Actually, if there's any further detail we can provide since our report's been published.
So if I can just make a very brief comment there, that I think I said to Mr Beattie, the plans, the phased plans are in development, so the full resource envelope for mental health services has been identified, but the Health Board is still going through one-to-ones with staff to determine how many of them will transfer to Murray Royal, to the single site, and what the alternatives would be, and the outcome of that will determine some of the costings.
Okay. And can you tell me at what point is your understanding of that live? So is this as of today? Because I have a very different understanding in terms of the completion of the one-to-ones. This was a process that staff were told was meant to be completed by August of this year. They were told in the end of June that it wouldn't be happening, 4 weeks before it was meant to be completed, that it wasn't happening. I had been telling the Health Board for many months there was no chance of it happening in August of this year, and that was absolutely clear. There's been no publication in terms of the costs, of the capital costs, investment in Murray Royal that have been required. Nothing in terms of the overtime that would be required for the transfer of staff from one place to another. Meeting with bank staff, the shortfall. Have you seen plans that actually contain that kind of detail? And have the board examined the cost of making this move, versus the need for delivery for patients.
Yeah.
At the time of our review, those were not in place.
And what time was that?
That was in May.
Okay. So,
in many respects, I think the questions you're asking are very reasonable, but I think they're for the board
yes.
to give answers to. I think the purpose of our report is to draw Parliament's attention to the findings of our annual audit report, and I appreciate that there's a live, fluid environment, sure. And we'll continue to track and monitor.
I suppose what I'm asking,
Michael.
Yes.
Really, you can ask one final question, but then we need to move on.
Okay. I appreciate that. I suppose I'm just trying to get you on the record, Auditor General, to say that this plan should be published with the costings and a delivery timeline for the delivery of the single site provision for the board to scrutinise and for the public to be able to see.
I think it's that last point. It has to be subject to appropriate scrutiny, be realistic, be subject to all the necessary engagement with staff so that it's a realistic plan. I think maybe that speaks to much of the wider points that we have in today's report. There have been many plans, proposals, intentions set out for the delivery of mental health services in Tayside. That the next plan is realistic and deliverable is clearly what matters, and we will continue to follow progress and report publicly, Convener.
Okay. Thank you for your tolerance.
Thank you very much. The Deputy Convener's just got one final question to put to you. So, Jamie, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think most ground has been covered on the report with those with far more in-depth knowledge of the subject than I do. But one thing has struck me throughout this evidence session, and indeed others similar, particularly around NHS boards, is that these are not new issues. These are things that have been raised by Audit Scotland to previous iterations of this committee, and no doubt future committees of public audit. But we're not talking about financial auditing here, we're talking about people involved, as the convener opened the session with, is that people are suffering and sometimes self-harming as a result of inaction. At what point, I suppose, Auditor General, does your what I would only assume is frustration in the lack of progress turn into something more statutory? You know, if we can't just keep producing Section 22 reports year after year after year after year, which say the same thing, and never see adequate progress or no accountability taking place within these public bodies. I mean, what more do you think we as a Parliament or the committee, or indeed you, in terms of your statutory abilities, what more could we do?
So my statutory powers are in evidence today. So I'm preparing a statutory report on an annual audit report to present to the Public Audit Committee as the accounts are laid in Parliament for Parliament to take evidence to consider my findings and then any next steps that this committee or others wish to do. That to me is evidence of the role of public audit working, so that we can allow Parliament to take a view, to hear from officials and any evidence that if you so decide to do so, as that is the system working, Deputy Convener. So I don't think this evidence is a shortfall. Actually, I think this is an example of Parliament's ability, through the work of Audit Scotland, to take evidence and hear any greater insight, and then to support scrutiny. What I don't have, nor do I think it would be appropriate, is for Audit Scotland or the Auditor General to have powers of intervention. I think that changes the independence dynamic that is important in this context. There are other audit and oversight regulatory bodies who do have those authorities, and some have been mentioned today, and I think it is for those organisations, together with the Scottish Government and ministers, to decide on any next steps that they so wish.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I am now going to close this agenda item and take the opportunity to again thank you, Eva Thomas-Tudo, Rachel Brown and Auditor General for the evidence that you've given us. There may be some things that require a bit of follow-up. We'll need to consider whether it's appropriate for us to get representatives from NHS Tayside into the Public Audit Committee to ask some further questions, but that's something we will consider in due course. But as agreed earlier by the committee, I will now move this meeting into private session. Thank you.